So I said something similar in my last response to Trent Horn, but at this point, I should just make a channel solely dedicated to responding to Trent Horn videos. Let me know in the comments if I should do that. Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm responding to Trent Horn's recent video, The New Case for God's Existence. I'll be putting his video at 1.25 times speed, so just be aware of that. Now, before we get into my criticisms, here are two nice words about Trent. First, I really appreciate him as a person. He has always been very kind to me, and I want to reciprocate that kindness in turn. As many of you know, I met him in person during a Capturing Christianity exchange a couple years back, and he's a really great dude. Of course, I will not be kind to his arguments. I will criticize those until they cry for their mothers. I also appreciate his commitment to raising the level of discourse and engaging scholarly material, at least to a decent degree, and much more than most apologists. Okay, so let's get on to Trent's preliminaries.
All right, so I was asked to give a presentation on the new case for God. And what I wanted to focus on are developments in philosophy of religion and defense of theism, the existence of God, that we have in the last 20 or 30 years. And I do want to give a caveat that this talk, I don't want to run you through, here's the entire argument, and here's every premise, and here's how to answer the objection. And by the end of the 45 minutes, okay, you understand everything, right? No, I don't. Just kick back, enjoy. This is an appetizer sampler platter. We're going to have some spinach artichoke dip from ethics, some jalapeno poppers from metaphysics. Try a little bit of each one, and for you to see what's out there and see the resources, and then hopefully go and check them out yourself if you want to go deeper in that. And we have really seen a renaissance in philosophy of religion from a Christian perspective.
All right, so keep in mind that Trent isn't aiming to give an extensive development of the arguments here, and nor is he aiming to address all objections to the arguments. So my purpose in my video is not to criticize Trent for failing to give an extensive development of the arguments or for failing to address all objections. So then we can ask, what then is my purpose in making this video? Well, it's actually quite similar to Trent's. I want you guys to kick back, relax, and enjoy a summary of some of the central problems for the arguments that Trent is providing. Problems which are themselves rooted in very recent scholarship in philosophy of religion. So, for example, in the past 3 years or so, I myself have published extensively on the new Kalam that Trent will mention. I've published extensively on the argument from change that Trent Horn will mention. I've published on the modal cosmological argument that he'll mention. And of course, other scholars have recently published a lot in response to these arguments too. And likewise, just as Trent will often point you guys to resources instead of developing certain points in significant depth, I will often point you guys to resources instead of developing certain points in significant depth. So a lot of this is just an act in making you guys aware of some of the best non-theistic scholarship in response to some of the new theistic cases that Trent is going to mention. Oh, and by the way, patrons have access to the 10,000 word document that I'm going to be relying upon in this video, and they'll thereby be able to click all the links to resources contained within the document. So that's like the 1,751st reason to become a patron of Majesty of Reason. Okay.
So these are some of the arguments I want to go through. And as I said, this is our appetizer sampler. So the different arguments I want to talk about. If you don't like quesadillas, once again, there are mozzarella sticks. There's some for everybody here. So I just want to go through a few of them. And some of them will seem familiar too. I'll talk about the argument, its roots, and how it's been developed and how philosophers are expanding upon it in the past 20, 30, even the past 10 years. People are still working to improve on the different subjects that they encounter. So the first one would be the argument from motion. Pop quiz, I'm sure you all know this argument because Tim explained it to you. You don't need me to re-explain it to you. You understand that. But if I had to give a little bit of a summary of it, Aquinas is saying that even if the universe existed for all time, we see motion. Motion is just when something potential becomes actual. So the water here, it is potentially solid, can't become ice on its own. It needs something to actualize it. Cold air. Air doesn't become cold on its own. Something has to actualize that. There's a chain.
All right. So the argument for motion or change. So here are some preliminary notes. If you're curious, I've published extensively criticizing this argument, defending dozens of problems therewith. A good place to start is my 2023 book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs, co-authored with Dr. Daniel Linford. Therein we have a long chapter criticizing a contemporary formulation and defense of Aquinas' first way by McNabb and DeVito, among others. And we also have a whopping 6 chapters directly or indirectly responding to Feser's Aristotelian proof, a proof which Trent Horn is going to be going on to talk about in his talk. I've also made lots of popular content on the argument. For that, you can see my argument from change playlist. And of course, I've responded to Trent Horn extensively whenever he has presented this argument in popular forums. All such responses can be found in my response videos playlist. Now, in the clip that I just played, Trent says motion or change is just when something potential becomes actual. Now, this account of what change is, or this definition of change, is often asserted as if it's some innocuous pre-philosophical truism, but it's anything but that. There are at least 5 problems with this account of what change is. First is what we can call the circularity problem. In particular, it seems circular to analyze change as a potential becoming actual, as Trent said, or as others have similarly said, a potential coming to be actualized, or something or some feature passing from potential being to actual being, or the transition from potency to act, etc. Notice that all of these are circular accounts or definitions of change. They're equivalent to analyzing change in terms of some state of potential being transitioning to, or passing to, or becoming, or, in short, changing to a state of actual being. This is just to analyze change in terms of change or cognates thereof, and hence it is a circular definition or account of what change is. It's like it's no good to analyze what it is to be a woman in terms of, to be a woman just is to be someone who identifies as a woman. It's like, hold on a second, you just use the term woman in your very account of what it is to be a woman, and so you just have a circular account. It's not a good analysis. It's not a good account. Notice also that we can't simply just get rid of words like becoming or their cognates and instead analyze change simply in terms of the bare actualization of potential. That's because we can easily imagine timeless actualizations of potential, right? Like imagine a timeless angel-like being whom a timeless God creates. There's a real sense in which the angel-like being's potential for existence is timelessly actualized or caused by God. But notice that this situation doesn't involve any change. So then the actualization of potential cannot be the right account of change. It seems like we have to smuggle in something like a state passing from or changing from potential being to actual being. And that, of course, further reinforces the circularity objection. A second problem with this account of change is that, at least in my estimation, there aren't many good reasons to accept it. Trent doesn't give any arguments for it. He just asserts that this is what change is, and this is a repeated theme in every video that I've ever seen him make on the argument. And his primary source, Fazer's 2017 5 Proofs book, only really gestures towards one argument for it. And this argument is developed a bit more fully in Fazer's 2014 book, Scholastic Metaphysics. That argument is not a good argument, as I explain in this blog post here, but we're not going to go into that because, again, this is just one of those instances where I'm pointing you guys towards an extant resource. So you can click this link if you're interested. That is on my blog. But that's the second problem for Trent's overall account of change. At least in my estimation, it's insufficiently justified or inadequately justified. A third problem is what we can call the implausibility problem. And it's just that the account of change just strikes me, at least, as deeply implausible. Mileage, of course, may vary here, depending on your own seemings. I'm just reporting mine. Consider that Trent's espoused account of change makes extremely controversial assumptions about existence that the vast majority of philosophers reject. For instance, it assumes ontological pluralism, which is the view that there are different kinds or types or modes of being or existence. Fazer himself makes this very explicit on pages 176 to 184 of his book 5 Proofs. He also makes this very explicit when he's expositing scholastic metaphysics in his 2014 book. And in particular, Trent's account assumes that there is an actual kind of being and a potential kind of being. But to me, at least, this seems very implausible. By my lights, something either actually exists or it doesn't exist at all. It's not as though there's like actual existence and then some spooky or ghostly potential existence that's somehow in between actual existence on the one hand and sheer nothingness on the other. In fact, that's exactly how Fazer characterizes potential being. He says it's somehow in between full-blown actual existence and sheer nothingness. I admit that this either makes no sense to me, or if it does make sense, it seems incredibly implausible to me. Moreover, as Chris McDaniel points out in his book, The Fragmentation of Being, and mind you, McDaniel is one of the most prominent defenders of a version of ontological pluralism, the denial of ontological pluralism is by far the dominant view among contemporary philosophers. If you're curious, one particularly strong argument against the kind of ontological pluralism required by the account of change in question can be found in Trent Merrick's Noose article published in 2019 entitled The Only Way to Be. I actually made a video with Dr. Merrick himself explaining his argument in that paper, and I apply his argument to actual and potential being specifically in section 7.13 of my blog post here. Also, if we commit to the reality of potential/potential being, we might be forced into strange commitments that we don't want to take on. For instance, we might be forced to posit uncountably infinitely many potentials that each thing possesses. So for example, for any natural number n and any string of natural numbers, most spatial objects will have the potential to be 1.n feet away from something, or 1 point any arbitrary string of natural numbers feet away from something. Likewise, things plausibly have the potential to exist for exactly n more seconds for any real number of seconds, etc. And we may not want to be forced into positing at least continuum many potentials had by each object. That might seem both facially implausible and deeply unparsimonious. This is just one example, by the way, of another potential problem. Wink, wink, potential. This is just an example of another, at least potential problem that Trent might face in his account of change. Again, I could go on and on. I'll spare you that. The broader point here is that not only is Trent's account of change circular and inadequately motivated, but there are also many independent arguments against it, like Trent and Merrick's argument. The significant majority of philosophers reject it, and it's independently very implausible, at least to me. The fourth problem for Trent's account of change is just that there are lots of alternative accounts of what change is, and popular defenders of the argument from change rarely even acknowledge their existence, let alone provide adequate reasons for rejecting them. So that's one way to articulate this fourth problem. The problem is that the defender of the argument from change would need to rule out these alternative accounts, and yet they've failed to do so. This, of course, would be mounting an undercutting defeater for the argument, showing that the argument or some step in there lacks adequate justification, rather than providing a rebutting defeater for the argument, which instead directly challenges the truth of one of the premises and gives us grounds for thinking that at least one of the premises or assumptions of the argument is false. But another way to articulate this fourth criticism is to positively argue that at least one or more of these alternative accounts are actually superior to Trent's account, thereby giving us positive reason to think that one of Trent's premises is false. This, of course, would be mounting a rebutting defeater for Trent's argument. So that's a different way to kind of construe this fourth criticism. So then we ask, what are some such alternative accounts of what change is, or what change consists in, or the real definition of change? Well, recall Trent's account. His account is that change occurs precisely when potential becomes actual. Well, then consider these two alternative accounts. X changes if and only if, for some predicate or property f, either x becomes f or x becomes not f. So for instance, if we let f be the property being red, x changes in respect of being red if and only if either x becomes red or x becomes not red. An equivalent way to put this is that x changes precisely when, for some predicate or property f, x goes from being f to not being f, or from not being f to being f. So when you go from not being red to being red, or when you go from being red to not being red. Notice that this account makes no mention of like potential being or potencies. And a second account is that x changes if and only if, for some predicate or property f, x is f at an earlier time, but not f at a later time, or vice versa. And x persists from the earlier time to the later time. This second account here is sometimes called the at theory of change, because it's basically saying that change happens when something has some property at one time and it doesn't have the property at another time, and the thing persists from the one time to the other. So that's another account of what change is. Now, these accounts seem to me to be entirely devoid of counterexamples, so they seem to be extensionally adequate, and they seem to give an account of what any change consists in. And moreover, they're considerably simpler than Trent's account in not requiring all the dubious metaphysical commitments to ontological pluralism, the denial of eternalism, as we'll see below, and more. So these alternatives seem to account for what change is just as well as Trent's account, and yet they're far simpler and don't have the sorts of controversial commitments that Trent's account incurs. And that way, they seem to me to be superior to Trent's account. Of course, note that at least for the first account here, that arguably suffers from the circularity objection considered above. But that, of course, is irrelevant to my fourth criticism here, since Trent's account also faces that objection, as I've pointed out. And my fourth objection here is simply that at least these accounts are better than Trent's, not that they're without any objections whatsoever. And then the fifth and final problem that I'll consider for Trent's account of change, and trust me, these do not exhaust the problems. The fifth problem is that the account in question assumes the falsity of eternalism. I'll explain what that is in just a second, but why might we think that this is a difficulty or a problem for the account? Well, it's a difficulty for the account because it represents a monumentally controversial theoretical commitment of the account. Substantial theoretical commitments like this detract from the modesty and hence the probability of a hypothesis. And furthermore, the account in question could only be true within the fraction of the probability space in which eternalism is false. Additionally, any argument for eternalism is ipso facto an argument against this account of change, meaning the account of change has many more objections than proponents thereof typically realize. So, for present purposes, eternalism is the view that all times, both past, present, and future, are equally actual and equally real. Under eternalism, time is analogous to space, in the sense that time is a dimension along which objects are extended, and space-time is therefore a four-dimensional static block. Technically, this is B-theoretic eternalism for those familiar with the distinction between A theory and B theory, but that's by far the most popular version of eternalism, and I'm just going to treat eternalism as B-theoretic eternalism going forward. Now, Trent's analysis of change assumes that eternalism is false. To see this, note first that there is obviously change over time. Even eternalists grant this, right? A plant is at one point a sapling, and then at a later point it's a full-grown tree. But then it's false under eternalism that such changes involve a transition from potentially existent things or attributes to actually existent things or attributes, right? Both the beginning and end points of the change are equally actual if eternalism is true, and hence there is no transition from potentiality to actuality under eternalism, even though there is change. Instead, the eternalists will adopt something like the at theory of change mentioned earlier. So, Trent's account of change assumes that eternalism is false. But, notably, eternalism is a formidable view, as I was saying earlier, and it does indeed have lots of arguments in its favor. And also, note that Trent himself, later in his talk, as we're going to see, he recognizes it as a difficulty for Craig's Kalam that it assumes a controversial view about the ontology of time. So then, to be consistent, I think Trent should be very sympathetic with my criticism here. So then, what are some of these arguments in favor of eternalism? Again, this is just to give you a flavor of these. I'm not claiming that these are successful arguments. Let me repeat that. I am not claiming that these are successful arguments. So general relativity, which is exceptionally empirically confirmed, seems to treat spacetime as a four-dimensional manifold. And special relativity arguably disallows absolute simultaneity and thereby casts doubt on a privileged objective present moment across the entire universe, and consequently casts doubt on non-eternalist theories of time which posit such a privileged present moment. These considerations are, of course, controversial, and there's a very large literature on them. But they have convinced many philosophers and physicists, so you should at least be aware of them. And remember, I'm not going to pursue all these dialectical tendrils in depth. I just want to give you guys a taste of the dialectic, a sampler. Remember the artichoke dip. And of course, there are also purely philosophical arguments for eternalism, such as arguments from truth, right? Consider that there seem to be truths about the past and future. For example, dinosaurs used to exist, or the sun will rise tomorrow, and so on. But we might think that for a statement P to be true, P must correspond to reality, to what exists. Truth is dependent on reality. It describes reality. So then the past and future, it seems, must exist in order for these statements to properly correspond with reality. And this, of course, is just one example of an eternalist philosophical argument. None of these are knockdown arguments, of course, but they do show that there might be serious problems with analyzing change as a potential becoming actual. And again, I'm just giving a bare bones summary of some of the arguments in this area. So, there we go. We are one sentence into Trent's case, and there are already at least 5 objections to consider. So you can see how this is going to go.
Imagine you had a boxcar going by you. It's being pulled by another boxcar. It's okay, what's pulling that boxcar? Well, another boxcar. What's pulling that one? And say you have a friend who says, I think there's just an infinite number of boxcars, each pulling the one before it. That's not an explanation, because you could have an infinitely long train of boxcars that stands still. Why do you have an infinitely long train of boxcars that's moving rather than standing still? The answer is there is a car that gives motion to the train without receiving motion from anything else, a prime mover, an purely actual actualizer of potential, the argument from motion.
All right, so the boxcar regress. So the only reason Trent has sent us off on a regress of causes here is that in the background, he's of course assuming that whenever a potential becomes actual, there must be a cause thereof. This is a premise in almost every argument from motion, and it's one that Trent himself has stated in the past when he has presented this argument. But I don't find this premise particularly plausible, since in my view it's quite plausible that some actualizations of potential can be explained without being causally explained, or without being causally actualized. There are many non-causal explanations, after all. For example, explanations in terms of grounding, functional realization, logical and structural constraints, essentialist explanations, and so many more. For those interested, I give many examples of non-causal explanations and cite boatloads of relevant literature in mistake number 76 of part 3 of my Common Mistakes series. Graham-Oppy makes this point in response to Phaser in a paper published in Religious Studies. We can explain why a chair's potential to exist at the next moment is actualized by citing, say, the absence of anything that destroys the chair. Here we have a perfectly illuminating explanation of why the chair's potential to exist at the next moment is actualized, and yet this potential is not causally actualized by something already actual. Note, of course, that Phaser responds to Oppy's paper here. I've linked his response here. And, of course, I extensively respond to Phaser's response to Oppy, both in my blog, which I've linked here, as well as in my book. I cite and respond to Phaser's response here extensively. Note, too, that my co-author and I give much more precise and worked-out explanatory schemas like this in our book on existential inertia. There are many explanations of why objects' potential to exist at subsequent moments is actualized that make no reference whatsoever to any external sustaining cause which continually actualizes that potential. we extensively defend at least a half dozen different kinds of explanations one could appeal to here in Chapter 6 of our book. In fact, in Chapter 4 of our book, we argued that the causal principle on which Trent implicitly relies seems to entail the thesis of existential inertia, which in turn creates a serious problem for Trent's argument because, of course, the existential inertia thesis undermines other aspects of that argument. Our case for this entailment, though, is a bit complicated, so I think it's better just to direct people to Chapter 4, as well as my formalized rendition of the argument contained in Chapter 4 within the errata list for the book. That errata list is on my blog. And, of course, it's linked here. As for the boxcar analogy itself, there's a really nice recent paper in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion from 2022 directly addressing this very analogy and arguing that it doesn't actually show that we must reach a prime mover. The paper is by philosopher Tom Oberle, and it's called Grounding Infinite Regress and the Thomistic Cosmological Argument. Trent also asserts without justification that we don't have an explanation in the infinite regress case, but this too has been challenged by lots of recent scholarship, which I'd like to put on your guys' radar. Tom Oberle has done lots of work on this. He's published in Phil Quarterly in 2023, his paper No Work for Fundamental Facts, his paper Metaphysical Explanation and the Cosmological Argument in Phil Studies from 2024, his paper Metaphysical Foundationalism and the Principle of Sufficient Reason in 2022 in the journal Dialogue. Alexander Billon, I think that's how you pronounce it. He has two papers, one in Erkenntnis from 2021 and one forthcoming in the journal Dialectica. The first one is entitled Are Infinite Explanations Self-Explanatory? The second one is entitled A Recipe for Complete Non-Well-Founded Explanations. Ross Cameron also has a book where he defends infinitely descending chains of dependence like this. It's called Chains of Being, Infinite Regress, Circularity, and Metaphysical Explanation, published with Oxford University Press in 2022. And so this is just like a meta point here. Trent is going on about this new case for God and whatnot. But notice here and throughout my presentation here that there are new and extensive cases against the new case for God. And this is something that we can't ignore. I'm not saying that Trent is ignoring it. Of course, Trent can't go over all of this literature in his talk. But my point is that I don't want you guys, or I don't want the audience to ignore this sort of thing and just pay attention to the case for God. We also need to look at the case against the case for God, as well as new cases against God's existence. And the various arguments that Trent has been putting forward have been extensively challenged, like I said, even within the last 3 to 4 years, as these various citations show. Trent also says that this prime mover must be purely actual, but this inference is littered with non sequiturs, as shown extensively in chapters 2 and 3 of my book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. Also, the inferences from purely actual to various divine attributes are almost uniformly incredibly poor, as shown in chapter 8 of my book on the gap problem. In fact, there are many independent arguments that God couldn't be purely actual, arguments that are developed in my classical theism playlist, in my Sophia article on arbitrary creation, in my Philosophia article on the providential collapse and intentional collapse arguments, and more. Again, my goal here is to give you guys a taste of the new case against the new case for God. As with Trent's talk, I'm not delving into these arguments in depth. I've done that in other videos and papers in my book. And of course, again, I'm not criticizing Trent here when I mention these things for not including these sorts of resources in his talk, clearly.
I like this analogy when people say, well, if God created the universe, who created God? I say to someone who says that, your question is like asking if a locomotive pulls a train, what pulls the locomotive? You don't understand. God is not, just as a locomotive is not another car on a train, God is not another being within the universe that he created. The argument for motion, though, of course, has been criticized by people, philosophers. In the early 20th century, it was dismissed. A lot of it, the dismissal, when I look at philosophers, Mackey, for example, in his book, The Miracle of Theism, he thought it was a miracle anybody could be a theist nowadays. When I look at him and William Rowe and others, they oftentimes will go back to Anthony Kenny's 1969 essay on the 5 ways, saying that Kenny refuted Aquinas. Aquinas uses Aristotelian physics, that his arguments don't work, like saying that in order to become actual, something potentially hot needs to be actualized by something that is hot. So something that can potentially be on fire has to be actualized by something that is on fire. And so you can only light wood on fire with other fire. And then Kenny says, well, I mean, you can rub 2 sticks together. They're both potentials and they actualize themselves. But of course, other philosophers have answered these arguments and answered these criticisms and expanded the argument. One of them is the Catholic philosopher Edward Feser, who teaches at Pasadena City College. In his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, Feser answers this objection, saying that the critic has misconstrued Aquinas. Aquinas is not saying a potential can only be actualized by something that is the actual of that type, like wood only becomes fire by actual fire. It's just potentials can only be actualized by something that is actual. 2 actual pieces of wood being rubbed together. Aquinas is not saying that whatever causes something actually to be F, like fire, must itself be fire in some way, but rather that whatever causes something must itself be actual. Nothing merely potential can cause anything. There are other arguments that come forward. Actually, to bring this here. We have people like Graham Oppie, who's a very intelligent atheist. He has a book, 2006 book called Arguing About Gods. He has other objections to Aquinas, saying, well, all Aquinas has proved is that there is a purely actual cause of one thing. So,
okay, so very briefly, I mean, perhaps Trent has misspoken. That's a possibility. So we need to keep that in mind. We need to extend a principle of charity. But at least as Trent was saying it here, characterizing what Oppie has said here, Oppie does not say that. Nowhere have I seen Oppie grant that Aquinas can even infer anything purely actual at all. He certainly doesn't say that in his 2006 book, Arguing About Gods, which is shown on screen. And in fact, in Oppie's generally favorable review of my book in religious studies, which I've also linked in the document that's available to patrons, Oppie agrees with the central criticism in my book that Aquinas doesn't even get to something purely actual.
Motion-based cause that gives motion. Maybe all light comes from something that's pure light. Maybe all heat comes from something that's pure heat. Those are the actual causes of things. You don't need one purely actual actualizer or God. And what Feser has done, he has like a 50-premise argument for the existence of God in 5 proofs. But the most interesting part is probably the first 14 premises, where Feser breaks down the argument more into systematic premises. And this is helpful because the 5 ways, when Aquinas presented them, they were just notes for novice theology students. They were not meant, Aquinas would be aghast if he thought people read the 5 ways and thought this was his definitive defense of the existence of God. These were notes to catch people up. When you read the Summa Theologia and it says that this is designed for beginners, you feel really dumb. Like, because we need a useful textbook for those who are beginners, I shall write this. Like, yeah, losers wouldn't understand any of this stuff. What Feser's done is taken the argument, extrapolated, adding more premises, including this very important premise here, premise 9, talking about how even if you did have pure light, pure motion, pure heat, the potential for those pure things to exist at all would have to be actualized by something that is pure existence itself. And this is an important premise that he has defended at length, engaging Oppie on the criticism that things can exist and just persist in existence, what's called existential inertia. So when it comes to the argument for motion, Feser's not the only one. There are others who have published in Blackwell and other journals, other variants of the argument for motion, but I like the one that's here in 5 proofs of the existence of God. And Feser has a good response to general objections from atheists at the end of the book, but he has that argument for motion there.
So as for Feser's argument itself, again, I've systematically addressed everything Feser has said in defense of his claim that there needs to be a concurrent external sustaining cause of any changeable thing at any moment at which it exists, including Feser's own responses to Oppie that Trent himself mentioned. This can all be found in my book. In fact, a whopping 6 chapters directly or indirectly respond to Feser's Aristotelian proof, including both stages, stage 1 and stage 2 thereof. But anyway, let's move on to the Kalam cosmological argument. Oh, and here, before going back to Trent, of course, there's whenever the Kalam mentioned, I emerge from the shadow realm to shout out my Kalam playlist, wherein every nook and cranny of this argument is evaluated in extensive detail, including the philosophical case of the beginning of the universe, the scientific case of the beginning of the universe, the Kalam's causal principle, different versions of the Kalam, the second stage of reasoning, wherein divine attributes are argued for, and so on. It's all in there. Right now, it's 44 videos. Maybe it'll be 45 after I add this video to it. We'll see.
Let's move on to a fun one. You might remember this from yesterday. I had my dialogue with Jimmy Akin. This would be the Kalam cosmological argument, all right? So Aquinas and Bonaventure disagreed on a particular issue in their time. And if you were at the dialogue with Jimmy, you may remember some of this. If not, here's a presentation. For others, a little bit of a refresher. And the question is, can we know from reason alone that the universe began to exist, that its past is finite? We know from faith. We know that God created the universe. He told us so. The church teaches us that from nothing in the finite past. But could you prove that a finite past is impossible? Reason shows the past cannot be infinite. Aquinas did not think so. St. Bonaventure did think so. Both are doctors of the church, so there are 2 positions you were allowed to hold as a Catholic. The argument, though, because Aquinas is kind of a heavy hitter, because he didn't like it, well, I'm not going to like it either. So a lot of people weren't big fans of it after that, for the next 700 years, until a evangelical philosopher and theologian named William Lane Craig published a dissertation on the argument called the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam is an Arabic word. It means speech. And others have worked to improve on the argument since then. Very simple argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This is his 1978 dissertation. And he's now, since then, what's interesting one of the objections to the argument is that it relies on particular views of things like the philosophy of time. We talk about a past infinite. Well, what is time itself at all? We have to settle that. So in the meantime, Craig had updated his argument. In 2009, he published a very lengthy defense of it in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And he uses two different kinds of arguments to prove the second premise here. So whatever the universe began to exist, you see that here, whatever begins to exist as a cause, well, how do we know the universe began to exist so that it has a cause? How do we know that? He uses two forms of argument. One would be scientific evidence, saying, look, we look at evidence from the Big Bang, look at evidence from cosmology, and it seems that the universe had a particular point of beginning. Though Jimmy was very careful, and I agree with him in the dialogue we had yesterday, this is more suggestive than completely demonstrative. Science is tentative. Maybe it'll find a beginning even before this point here in the Big Bang. But many people look at this evidence, and it seems that the universe, they say, okay, I could see the universe comes from nothing. That's the scientific evidence.
So yeah, the scientific case. The scientific case is far weaker than popular apologists at least often want you to think, and science does not show that the universe began to exist, as Daniel Linford convincingly argues in his 2022 doctoral dissertation, Cosmic Skepticism, the Beginning of the Universe, linked here. You can also just find it online by searching it up. You can find a PDF. There's currently no consensus among expert cosmologists about whether the expansion of the local space-time manifold that we inhabit and observe marks the absolute beginning of the totality of all physical reality. Of course, no one seriously doubts that 13.8 billion years ago, the local space-time manifold that we inhabit and observe started to rapidly expand. But what is seriously doubted among many expert cosmologists and philosophers of physics is that this expansion marks the absolute beginning of the existence of the totality of all physical reality. That is not adequately supported by the science. By the way, I also had Dr. Linford on my channel to respond to Craig's main scientific arguments here. We talk about the second law of thermodynamics, we talk about the BGV theorem, we address those arguments, etc. So check out that video in case you're interested. That is also in my Kalam playlist, but I'm shouting it out here. But onwards we march to the ever-painful Hilbert's Hotel.
Craig uses arguments from philosophy saying that, well, no, the past cannot be infinite. Because that would lead to contradictions. Actual infinites cannot exist. And he uses examples like Hilbert's Hotel, developed by the German mathematician David Hilbert, late 19th, early 20th century. Hilbert's Hotel says, look, Hilbert said that the infinite exists as an idea. Because when you have it in reality, you get all kinds of weird contradictions. You could have everybody in the hotel, and you could continue to check in an infinite number of people by shifting them around in the rooms. If you subtract identical quantities, so if you subtract all the odd-numbered guests from Hilbert's Hotel, how many are left? An infinite number. Everyone in the even rooms. If everybody after room 4 checks out from the hotel, you remove an infinite number of guests. How many are left? 4. Infinity minus infinity in one case equals infinity. In another case, infinity minus infinity equals 4. It's a contradiction. That's why in transfinite arithmetic, it's prohibited to subtract infinite sets, but you can't stop these people from leaving Hilbert's Hotel.
Okay, so for Hilbert's Hotel, I mean, first things first, definitely I'd highly recommend checking out my 3-hour-long video extensively detailing about a dozen problems for Craig's argument here. Trent is saying here, at least expositing the argument. So Trent says you get all kinds of contradictions. No, you don't. Those aren't contradictions. The subtraction argument demonstrably confuses the relative complement function on sets with arithmetic subtraction on numbers, as Lewis Swingrover shows in his article here, that I link here, and as I extensively explain in the above video. Trent said, Cantorian arithmetic debars subtraction of infinite sets. No, subtraction is not, strictly speaking, subtraction is not a function on sets at all. It's a function on numbers. And actually, set subtraction, which is the relative complement function, it's also known as set subtraction, is perfectly well defined for infinite sets. And it's perfectly consistent in the case of infinite sets. You can perfectly well perform the relative complement function with infinite sets, which just is set subtraction. And that's what's actually going on in the case of Hilbert's Hotel and the various guests. You're taking a determinate collection or set of members and removing that from another particular determinate set or collection of members. You're not taking numbers and performing the subtraction function on numbers. So there's just a very basic and demonstrable confusion in this sort of reasoning. Also, arithmetic subtraction is conventionally prohibited in Cantorian formulations of transfinite arithmetic, but there are also perfectly well-behaved and extensively studied non-Cantorian formulations of transfinite arithmetic, in which subtraction with infinities is allowed and is perfectly well-defined. This is also a point covered in the above video, and I give various references therein if you want to dig deeper into these non-Cantorian formulations of transfinite arithmetic. Also, as explained in that video, this argument here would also imply that endless futures are impossible, since we can equally consider exactly similar manipulations of collections of future events, as explained in the above video. Moreover, the argument isn't generalizable to an infinite past, since the infinite past isn't manipulable in the way that members of the hotel are, and so on down the list of problems with this argument. Again, I cover about a dozen or so in the above video.
Though there are particular objections that are leveled at it, and I actually do agree with these objections. It is humbling as an apologist or a philosopher or a theologian, anyone who puts forward an argument in the public square, you will receive criticism of your argument. You will receive, and I think it's quite a mark of intellectual integrity if you can receive criticism and then modify your argument in the face of the criticism instead of just bluntly ignoring it. And that's what all of us try to do as apologists. Well, it doesn't have to be the existence of God. It could be anything. It's about the New Testament, the church fathers. We'll go out, put forward an argument in a debate. Some will do well. Other arguments, that one didn't do so hot. I need to change it or drop it. And it's hard because we're not our own worst critics sometimes. But we can learn from how others criticize it. And it's great. That's why I love the dialoguing with Jimmy yesterday here at the conference. Because the best people I love to tear apart my arguments are my smart apologist friends. Because we all have goodwill in our hearts. We're not going to be mean to each other, but we can point out problems that we see. And so that's why the book of Proverbs says that iron sharpens iron, so man sharpens his fellow man. That's what we do a lot at Catholic Answers.
So one thing I do want to say here is that we should take a step back and be grateful for Trent here. Those of you who have followed my channel and have seen my previous responses to Trent know that Trent, not too long ago, defended these very arguments that Craig puts forward. Trent was making the Hilbert Hotel argument. He was making these various points, but he has since changed his mind in light of the force of the objections. This is wonderful, and I sincerely praise him for it.
So there's a few different criticisms of the argument. One is that it relies on a theory of time that is not super popular with physicists and philosophers. I'm not going to get into all this because it's kind of complicated. What moment does the past and future, do they exist, or does only the present exist? That's presentism. This is kind of a goofy model that I like because I'm a goofy guy. Called the growing block. The past is real. Only the present, though, for me, is where consciousness is, and the future is still open. Many physicists hold to this block view. Past, present, and future are equally real. So if that is the case, you have to be careful, as Jimmy pointed out in our discussion yesterday. Because we as Christians believe that the future is endless, if your argument for a beginningless past, if you say, yeah, the past cannot be infinite, you better be careful. You don't want to have an argument that shows that the future cannot be infinite. Because you have a problem, because God told us the future is infinite. He promised us that in the book of Revelation. We have endless life. It's infinite. So since we know the future is infinite, any argument that would show the past and the future are finite, well, that's not going to work. So one has to take that into account. The other problem is that impossible actual infinites, even if something like Hilbert's Hotel can't exist, say, yeah, you can't have a hotel with infinite rooms, all kinds of crazy stuff happens there. That might not apply to the past, because past events, they don't exist. Like all of this stuff, if you, William Lane Craig, he holds to this presentist view where the past does not exist anymore, and the past no longer exists, the future doesn't exist yet. So there is no actual infinite events here all together, like at Hilbert's Hotel, for the contradictions to arise. So that creates a lot of problems to the argument. Are there ways to, so that's why in my dialogue with Jimmy, I've sought to try to rework the argument and I'm drawing from other people who looked at the argument to say, maybe we can rework it a little bit. I like the work of Andrew Loke, for example. He teaches, I think, at Hong Kong Baptist University. Very smart guy. He's written a number of books. In fact, I have two of them in this presentation to refer you to. He has another book on the cosmological argument. This one's good. The teleological and Kalam cosmological arguments revisited. This is not in his book, but it's based on stuff that is in here. I would put an argument like this. If the past were infinite, then contradictions would be possible. Contradictions are not possible. Therefore, the past is not infinite. I do fix this later. But for me, what I'm trying to say in the argument is not that an infinite past is a contradiction that can't exist, but an infinite past leads to contradictions.
All right. So I confess that premise one here just seems overwhelmingly implausible to me, and I don't think there's particularly good reason to accept it. We can tell inconsistent stories involving an infinite past, but we can only infer from this that the whole story is impossible, not that infinite pasts in particular are impossible. Inferring the latter is like inferring that taxis are impossible from the fact that we can tell inconsistent stories involving taxis.
Hilbert's Hotel and past events aren't the same thing. You're right. But if the past were beginningless, you could build one hotel room at a time, or you could have one indestructible object come into existence every 10 gazillion years. If you had one indestructible object pop into existence every 10 gazillion years, or two particles hit, two more particles come into existence. It doesn't matter even if the space between the events is huge, a Google years, 1 and 100 zeros, it would still have an actual infinite number of things in the present moment. An infinite past would yield these kinds of contradictions. You would have a Hilbert's Hotel today. You would not have that. If you started building Hilbert's Hotel into an endless future, the contradictory hotel will not exist, but you would in an infinite past. So that shows there can be problems with an infinite past.
So one thing to say before getting into these arguments for the finitude of the past, and this is just a very general and, in my view, very powerful criticism of arguments for the Kalam's second premise more generally. And the problem is that these arguments could only support the claim that the universe began to exist if we can somehow infer from the finitude of the past to the beginning of the universe. But that inference does not go through. We cannot conclude that the universe began to exist from the fact that the past is finite. And in fact, I'm going to play a clip from mistake number 82 in my Common Mistakes series explaining exactly why this is the case. And this, of course, bridges us very nicely into mistake number 82, which is the illicit slide from finite past to the universe began to exist, or thinking that the past being finite implies that the universe began to exist. It does not, and you cannot infer that the universe began to exist merely from the fact that the past is finite. As Craig himself recognizes, we cannot conclude that something begins to exist merely from the fact that its past is finite. For Craig thinks that God's past is finite, and yet God didn't begin to exist, right? Otherwise, God would require a cause in Craig's view. Craig thinks God's past is finite because Craig thinks God exists in time since the moment of creation, and there has only been, on Craig's view, a finite amount of past time during which God has existed. So then, having a finite past is not enough for beginning to exist, and the reason for this, in the case of Craig's view of God, is that God existed timelessly sans creation, or timelessly without and causally prior to the creation of metric time. So then, in Craig's view, God doesn't begin to exist at the beginning of metric time. Instead, God merely begins to be temporal, as it were. He doesn't arrive anew onto the scene of reality. So then, one way for something to have a finite past and yet fail to begin to exist is if it, or some portion of it, exists timelessly sans its temporal life. And there are other ways, too, in principle, for something to fail to begin to exist while nevertheless having a finite past. For instance, something could pre-exist the beginning of metric time in a non-metric or amorphous time, which is a temporal state for which there is no objective fact of the matter concerning its length or duration. This view has been proposed by Richard Swinburne, Ryan Mullins, and Alan Paget. In the case of God, it's their view. It's called the Oxford School of Divine Temporality. And there being non-metric time has also been proposed for portions of cosmological history under Roger Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology. Once more, if something pre-exists the beginning of metric time in a beginningless but not infinitely long non-metric time, right? It's beginningless but not infinitely long because there's no objective fact of the matter concerning its duration, right? So it's not true that it began to exist finitely long ago, but it's also not true that it has lasted infinitely long. Both of those would involve there being some objective fact of the matter concerning its duration. But since it's non-metric, there isn't such a fact of the matter. So, once more, if something pre-exists the beginning of metric time in a beginningless but not infinitely long non-metric time, then even if its past is finite, it doesn't arrive anew onto the scene of reality at its first moment of metric time, and so it doesn't truly begin to exist then. And Craig himself seems to agree that this view wouldn't imply that the entity pre-existing metric time in a non-metric time begins to exist, since Craig himself has said in his discussion with Ryan Mullins on my channel that he thinks this is a theologically legitimate view for someone to hold in the case of God, which he wouldn't think if he thought it implied that such an entity began to exist, where by such an entity I mean an entity which pre-exists metric time in a state of non-metric time. And there are still other ways too for something to fail to begin to exist even though its past is finite. For instance, it may have a timeless aspect in Dr. Linford's sense, which we talk about in our discussion, linked above and linked here, and which he discusses in his excellent paper, A Modal Condition for the Beginning of the Universe. Finally, the totality of physical reality may fail to begin to exist, even though its past is finite, if there's a timeless physical reality in addition to temporal physical realities whose past is collectively finite. In such a case, physical reality would be finite towards the past, even though it isn't true that the entirety or totality of physical reality began to exist, since at least one thing within that totality is timeless and so cannot begin to exist. I go through all these points and more in these videos here. So then, here are 4 ways, at least in principle, in which the universe, understood as the totality of physical reality, can have a finite past, even though it did not begin to exist. First, some physical entity may exist timelessly sans metric time, but temporally since the beginning of metric time. Secondly, some physical entity may have pre-existed the beginning of metric time in a beginningless but not infinitely long state of non-metric time. Third, some physical entity might have a timeless aspect, in the sense that while the entity is non-fundamentally temporal, it's fundamentally timeless, and it would have existed even if time hadn't existed. That's where I cited Linford's work above. And fourth, some physical reality might be timeless simpliciter, full stop, as many physicists and philosophers of physics take the universal wave function to be. So then, it is a mistake to swiftly infer that the universe began to exist merely from the fact that the past is finite. To infer that, you'd have to rule out each of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Always keep this in mind when someone tries to justify the second premise of the Kalam, according to which the universe began to exist, by arguments that would, if successful, only show that the past is finite. And by the way, that's like almost every single argument for the second premise of the Kalam. So this is a massive problem for the Kalam more generally. In short, the universe's beginning doesn't actually follow from the finitude of the past, and you should be on your guard to spot this illicit shift whenever it arises. And for more on non-metric time, you can see these resources here: Richard Swinburne's 1993 article, God and Time, Alan Paget's 1992 book, God, Eternity, and the Nature of Time, Ryan Mullins' forthcoming book, From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, numerous of Mullins' articles available on his website, popular presentations in various videos of mine that I've done with Ryan Mullins himself, Penrose's Conformal Cyclic Cosmology, etc. So, then, to summarize this 80-second mistake, I'm just going to enjoin you to please stop saying that past finitude is sufficient for beginning to exist, and please stop thinking that showing that the universe is past finite is sufficient for showing that the universe began to exist. Just because something is finite towards the past doesn't mean that it began to exist. And again, all this means that arguments for the finitude of the past don't actually show the second premise of the Kalam, right? They don't actually show that the universe began to exist. One would also need to show that neither the universe nor any physical object whatsoever could exist timelessly sans the beginning of metric time, and nor could they have a timeless aspect in Linford's sense, and nor could they pre-exist the beginning of metric time in a non-metric time. And furthermore, nor could any physical object just be timeless simpliciter. As far as I'm aware, no proponent of the Kalam has even undertaken the task of giving sufficient reasons to rule out each and every one of these, let alone accomplished such a feat. I think this is a very serious problem, and a seriously underrated problem for defenses of the Kalam cosmological argument's second premise. So that's a more general criticism of both of Trent's newer sub-arguments that he offers in this talk on behalf of the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. But now let's go on to criticisms specific to each of them, starting with Trent's argument from the Hilbert's Hotel construction. Now, in my view, this is not a good argument. I've extensively addressed it in my Hilbert's Hotel video from earlier. I'll play a clip from that video here. Now, buckle up. This is a 20-minute clip, but it's super philosophically juicy, and I hope it serves you well.
Now let's look at the third reply to the hasty generalization problem on behalf of proponents of the Kalam. This one is developed in Al-Ghazali, or Al-Ghazali if you're William Lane Craig, Andrew Loke, and several others. And this reply is that even if there's a relevant dissimilarity between an infinite past on the one hand and coexistent manipulable infinite collections on the other, the possibility of an infinite past actually entails the possibility of coexistent manipulable infinite collections. Hence, the absurdity of the latter implies the absurdity of the former. Here's how Al-Ghazali put it. Imagine that every day God creates an immortal human. If the universe has existed for an infinite number of days, then there would also be an infinite number of humans coexisting in reality. Thus, if it's impossible for an infinite collection to coexist, it's also impossible for an infinite temporal regress to exist. Andrew Loke puts things similarly. Suppose this is how Hilbert's Hotel is constructed. There exists a hotel room builder who has been building hotel rooms at regular time intervals as long as time exists. Suppose there also exists a customer generator which has been generating customers who checked in the hotel at regular time intervals as long as time exists. Suppose that the hotel rooms and the customers continue existing after they've been built and generated respectively. Now, if the actual world is one in which the universe is past eternal, then there would have been an actual infinite number of time intervals, and an actual infinite number of hotel rooms and customers occupying the rooms. The absurd situation which Craig describes would then happen if, for example, a new customer comes to the hotel asking for a place to stay when every room is already occupied. Now, again, I've already responded to these alleged absurdities, but let's just suppose for the sake of argument that they are absurd, and that coexistent actual infinite collections are all impossible. With all this in mind, and ignoring the customer generator for ease of exposition, the argument here that Loke and Al-Ghazali are offering is something like the following. 1. If the past could be infinite, then it could be the case that a unique hotel room is created on each day of the infinite past, while only finitely many such rooms are ever destroyed. 2. If it could be the case that a unique hotel room is created on each day of the infinite past, while only finitely many such rooms are ever destroyed, then a Hilbert's Hotel is possible. 3. A Hilbert's Hotel is not possible. So what follows from those is that the past cannot be infinite. Again, we're granting premise 3 here for the sake of argument, but what about premises 1 and 2? Well, premise 2 is obviously true, right? If a unique hotel room is built on each of the infinitely many past days, And if at most finitely many of those rooms are ever destroyed, well, then clearly there will be infinitely many hotel rooms in the present. That is, there would be a Hilbert's hotel for all practical purposes. But what about premise one here, right? Why think that an infinite past's possibility entails the possibility that on each day of an infinite past, a unique hotel room is created, while only finitely many such rooms are ever destroyed? Well, you might think that a hotel room could be built on each of, say, 5 days of the past, if the past is infinite. Similarly, a hotel room could be built on each of 500 days of the past if the past is infinite. And the same is true of 5 million, 5 quadrillion, 5 quintillion, indeed possibly any number, including an infinite number. Moreover, there's no specific day of the infinite past on which the construction of a hotel is simply impossible. And what this means is that each day of the infinite past is such that a hotel room is possibly built on that day. And one might think that we can infer from this that it's possible that on all days of the infinite past, a hotel room is built. Moreover, nothing forces infinitely many such rooms to be destroyed, and so it also seems possible for only finitely many of them to have ever been destroyed. If all this is right, then premise one is secured. Nevertheless, I don't think this argument succeeds, and there are 3 primary reasons for this. First, premise one is seriously undermotivated and arguably false. So recall premise one, right? Premise one is that link between the possibility of an infinite past and the possibility that on each day of the infinite past, a unique hotel room is created on that day, while only finitely many such hotel rooms are ever destroyed, right? So recall premise one more precisely. It says that if the past could be infinite, then it could be the case that a unique hotel room is created on each day in the infinite past, while only finitely many such rooms are ever destroyed. Now, the motivation we considered earlier was that because for each day of the infinite past, a hotel room could be built on that day, it plausibly follows that it's possible that on all days of the infinite past, one hotel room is built on that day. But this, of course, is clearly a non sequitur, right? From the fact that each member of a collection possibly has some property, it doesn't follow that it's possible that all the members of the collection have the property, right? Consider, for each day of the week, it's possible that I was born on that day, right? It's possible that I was born on Monday. It's possible that I was born on Tuesday, and so on for each day of the week. But it's obviously not possible that I was born on all the days of the week. That is, it's not possible for me to be born on all of them, all of Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and so on, right? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for me to be born on both Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and so on. So it's not possible for me to be born on all of the days of the week. So even though each of the days of the week is such that it's possible for me to be born on that day, it's not possible for me to be born on all the days of the week. Similarly, from the fact that on each day of the past, it's possible for a hotel room to be built on that day, it doesn't follow that it's possible for all the days of the past to have a hotel room built that day. And actually, by the way, this is a formal logical fallacy. It's a formal logical fallacy to try to infer from a construction involving a wide scope universal quantifier, so a universal quantifier all the way to the left, followed by a diamond, a possibility operator, to try to infer from that a corresponding claim where those two are switched, where the possibility operator is in wide scope, so it's all the way to the left, and then the universal quantifier is right next to it on the right. So that's actually a formally invalid inference. That's just for the logic geeks that I made that point, okay? So, if you didn't understand that point, don't worry, right? Just return to the case of me being born on each day of the week. Even though for each day of the week, it's possible that I was born on that day, it doesn't follow that it's possible that I was born on all the days of the week. Now, to make things simple, let's suppose that the hotel room builder is an omnipotent god. Now, omnipotence doesn't mean completely unrestricted power, right? It doesn't mean God can do literally anything. For instance, basically everyone agrees that God can't do what's metaphysically impossible. With this in mind, consider the following 2 claims. So here's the first claim, here's the second claim. The first claim we're going to call Formula A. For each natural number n, it is possible that God makes a hotel with n many rooms in total. And then Formula B. It is possible that God makes a hotel so big that there is a hotel room for every natural number n. Now, defenders of the Hilbert hotel argument will say that while Formula A is true, Formula B is false, right? For any natural number n, God could make a hotel such that the hotel rooms are numbered 1 to n, but he could not make a hotel where every single natural number corresponds to a unique room. The latter, but not the former, would involve creating a Hilbert's hotel, which we're assuming is simply impossible. As Malpass and Morriston write, we can put this general lesson in slogan form. For the defender of the Hilbert's hotel argument, each is possible, but not all. With this lesson in hand, a problem for premise 1 arises, right? Even if there's an infinite number of past events, such that at each of them God could have made a persistent hotel room, so long as his omnipotence is restricted to what's metaphysically possible, it doesn't follow that a Hilbert's hotel is thereby metaphysically possible. A hotel room builder with restricted omnipotence has the ability to spend any finite number of those past times creating hotel rooms, that is corresponding to Formula A, but not the ability to devote every one of an infinite number of pastimes to creating hotel rooms, which corresponds to Formula B. That is, a builder with restricted omnipotence could make it the case that the totality of past room creation events is numbered from 1 to n for any natural number n, but not that there is a unique past room creation event for every natural number n. To insist that the builder have the ability to do the latter is precisely to insist on violating the restriction on omnipotence to what's metaphysically possible. So then premise 1 is false, or at least it's unmotivated. Sure, for each natural number n, a builder can spend n many past days creating one hotel room per day, but it clearly doesn't follow from this that a builder can spend infinitely many past days creating one hotel room per day, right? A builder can spend any finite number of past days creating one hotel room per day, but it doesn't follow from that a builder can spend infinitely many past days creating one hotel room per day. And indeed, if, as we are assuming, a Hilbert's hotel is impossible, this latter ability isn't even a possible ability to have to begin with. In fact, not even an omnipotent being could do the latter, since it would entail the ability to make a Hilbert's hotel, which we are assuming is impossible. Now, one might object that this response is misguided, since there would be nothing to prevent the hotel room builder, in this case God, from spending each and every day of an infinite past constructing one hotel room per day. Locke expresses a version of this thought as follows. So Locke says God cannot build a Hilbert's hotel at one go because the metaphysical impossibility of Hilbert's hotel would act as a constraint to prevent him from doing that. However, can God build one room at a time? Sure he can. There is nothing that could prevent God from building a persistent room at t-1, and nothing that could prevent God from building a persistent room at t-2, and nothing that could prevent God from building a persistent room at t-3, etc. Locke continues. The two examples, that is creating a Hilbert's hotel instantly and over time, respectively, are not equivalent in a crucial way, right? There's a relevant difference between them. One involves at one go, right, creating a Hilbert's hotel all in one go, whereas the other involves a process of building a hotel up over time. This makes a difference because to prevent someone from doing something, the prevention has to happen before or at the instant of action. However, after the person has acted, he can't be prevented from acting because what has been done has already been done. What this implies is that later conditions cannot prevent earlier conditions from happening. But alas, this response is mistaken. Sure, nothing prevents God from taking any individual step along the process, but something most certainly does prevent God from taking each and every one of the infinitely many steps along the process. And furthermore, this is always eternally and necessarily true. This prevention is always in force, since taking each and every one of the infinitely many steps is impossible at all times and in all circumstances, right? It's similar to how nothing prevents me from being born on any individual day of the week, right? Nothing prevents me from being born on Monday, nothing prevents me from being born on Tuesday, nothing prevents me from being born on Wednesday, and so on for each individual day of the week. But something most certainly does prevent me from being born on each and every day of the week. In particular, that's just metaphysically impossible, right? It can't happen. Moreover, we don't have any retroactive prevention going on here, right? The metaphysical impossibility of God taking each and every one of the steps along the process prevents it from ever being the case that God undertakes this task. And this prevention is always in force, even from eternity past. By the way, here's how Malpass and Morriston themselves respond to Locke. And I don't know why the font is acting up this way, but, you know, it's kind of interesting. Gives it a little pop, doesn't it? So again, here's how Malpass and Morriston respond to Locke. What prevents God from adding hotel rooms one at a time and arriving at a Hilbert's hotel is that this is already a metaphysically impossible situation. Locke's suggestion, which painted the picture as if it required some spooky backwards in time influence from later conditions on earlier events, is in fact a straw man. If at t-1, God creates a single room, and then later at t0 there is a Hilbert's hotel, it follows that there already was a Hilbert's hotel at t-1. After all, the addition of one hotel room, or any finite number of hotel rooms, cannot ever be enough to change a finite hotel into an infinite one. So, if there is a Hilbert's hotel present now, then at every previous time, whenever God was adding hotel rooms, he was adding them to a Hilbert's hotel. But adding a room to a Hilbert's hotel is metaphysically impossible, just because the existence of a Hilbert's hotel, as we are assuming, is itself metaphysically impossible. The mistaken presupposition in Locke's response here is that we ever need to appeal to later conditions in order to rule out the earlier events in this scenario. If there is a Hilbert's hotel at any time, then each previous room building event is co-present with a Hilbert's hotel. And so there's really no retroactive preventative force going on here. The relevant metaphysical impossibility of God performing each and every one of the steps is always timelessly and eternally operative. So because of all the preceding, premise 1 is simply unmotivated. And that concludes my first response to this Loc al-Ghazali argument. But the Loc al-Ghazali argument also faces other challenges, which is my second response. For instance, it could easily be the case that infinite pasts simply always and essentially contain only a finite number of things. I see no reason whatsoever to rule this out, and yet ruling it out is required in order to justify premise 1. For if infinite pasts always and essentially contain only finitely many things, then it's simply impossible for anyone to construct Hilbert's hotel over the span of an infinite past, right? That would clearly require there to be some time at which infinitely many things exist. Yet another challenge for premise 1 is developed in philosopher Landon Hendrick's article Once More to the Hotel. So again, premise 1 says if the past could be infinite, then it could be the case that a unique hotel room is created on each day in the infinite past, while only finitely many such rooms are ever destroyed. So Hendrick writes, consider this hotel room builder steadily constructing room after room. Does the builder have an infinite supply of materials or a finite supply? Since we are already assuming that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist, we need to imagine that the builder only has a finite supply of materials. Having only a finite supply of materials to work with, the builder can only construct a finite number of hotel rooms before running out of materials. And since we are supposing that the entire world consists of only a finite number of things, the builder would only be able to build a finite number of hotel rooms, even if it used all of the contents in the world as its construction materials. Eventually, the builder would only be able to add on new rooms by tearing down old rooms and reusing the materials. But then, at no point would an infinite hotel exist, even if past eternalism were true. That is, even if the past were infinite in duration. And what this shows is that the possibility of an infinite past, by itself, doesn't at all entail the possible existence of coexistent infinite collections. Now, one way to get around this, of course, is to add that the hotel builder can create new materials ex nihilo. So when the builder runs out of materials, it simply says the magic words and poof, new materials pop into existence. But then the possibility of Hilbert's hotel doesn't follow just from the possibility of an infinite past, right? You need auxiliary assumptions. They need to be added. As Hendrick writes, once the details of Locke's thought experiment are spelled out, we see that he can derive the conclusion that the conjunction of past eternalism and these auxiliary assumptions is impossible. But of course, it doesn't follow from this that past eternalism is impossible, or even that past eternalism is false. To infer then that an infinite past is impossible from the argument under consideration, we would need to show that creation ex nihilo is possible. But that is an exceedingly difficult task. Not only does creation ex nihilo seem absurd to many, but it's also going to be difficult to establish its possibility without antecedently assuming the very question at issue in the Kalam debate, namely God's existence. And that concludes my second response to the Loc al-Ghazali argument. So here's my third response to the Loc al-Ghazali argument. It's that a symmetric argument would just as easily prove that the future cannot be endless. Just consider this symmetric argument. Premise 1 star. If the future could be endless, then it could be the case that a unique hotel room is destroyed on each day of the endless future, while only finitely many such rooms are ever created in such a future. 2 star, if it could be the case that a unique hotel room is destroyed on each day in the endless future, while only finitely many such rooms are ever created in such a future, then a Hilbert's hotel is possible. Premise 3 star, a Hilbert's hotel is not possible, and so conclusion the future cannot be endless. And of course, you can witness the symmetry here. All the words are exactly the same. You're just basically replacing past with future. You're replacing created with destroyed in each instance. And instead of saying the past is beginningless, you say the future is endless. Or instead of saying the past is infinite, you say the future is endless. Okay, so that's the symmetry, quite obvious symmetry between them. So premises 3 and 3 star are identical, as you can see. And like premise 2, right, premise 2 star is clearly true. I mean, I hope you can kind of just see that intuitively. I'm going to go through a demonstration here, just in case you can't see it intuitively. If you're destroying a unique hotel room on each day of the endless future, and you're only ever constructing finitely many such hotel rooms throughout the endless future, then there's going to be a Hilbert's hotel in the present, because you need infinitely many rooms to be able to destroy a unique room on each day of the endless future, while only building finitely many such rooms. So anyway, I hope you can kind of see that 2 star is intuitively true, but for those of you who don't kind of see that intuition directly, I'm going to give you a kind of demonstration here. So this is going to be a kind of technical demonstration. You're going to have to bear with me for this long paragraph, but I'm just demonstrating that 2 star here is true. Okay, so suppose that Hilbert's hotel is impossible. I'm supposing that the consequent here is false, and then I'm going to derive the falsity of the antecedent, right? In which case, that'll show that the falsity of the consequent implies the falsity of the antecedent. which is just another way of saying by contraposition that 2 star is true, right? That would mean that the truth of the antecedent entails the truth of the consequent. Okay, so we're going to suppose that Hilbert's hotel is not possible. So then at any given time, t, in any possible world, there are only finitely many hotel rooms at t. And we can now ask, could it be the case that a unique hotel room is destroyed on each day in t's endless future, while only finitely many such rooms are ever created in t's future? Well, clearly not. Recall that there are only finitely many rooms at time t. Furthermore, we've assumed that only finitely many more hotel rooms will be built in t's future. But then a unique hotel room won't be destroyed on each day of t's endless future. For if only finitely many hotel rooms exist at time t, and only finitely many more hotel rooms will be built in t's future, then at some future time t star later than t, it will be true that 1, no more hotel rooms will be built, and yet 2, only finitely many hotel rooms exist. But then after t star, clearly only finitely many hotel rooms can be destroyed. After all, only finitely many exist, none more will be built, and you can only destroy what already exists. So, since only finitely many hotel rooms can be destroyed after t star, and since a unique room is being destroyed per day, it follows that the destruction of rooms is going to come to an end after some finite number of days. But, of course, then it's false that a unique hotel room is destroyed on each day in t's endless future. That would require the destruction of rooms not to come to an end, contrary to what we've just concluded. Hence, by assuming the impossibility of a Hilbert's hotel, we concluded that it couldn't be the case that a unique hotel room is destroyed on each day in the endless future, while only finitely many such rooms are ever created in the future. Hence, if it could be the case that a unique hotel room is destroyed on each day in the endless future, while only finitely many such rooms are ever created in the future, it follows that a Hilbert's hotel is possible. And that is just a statement of premise 2 star, right? So if you look at this, that is just a statement of premise 2 star. So sorry that was a technical derivation, but it was for those of you who weren't kind of able to intuitively see 2 star. But I hope most of you are kind of able to see kind of just intuitively 2 star's truth. Finally, then, we ask about premise 1 star. Well, I say it seems entirely symmetrical to premise 1, right? Any reason favoring premise 1, it seems, would equally favor premise 1 star. And in that case, there's no principled way to accept premise 1 while rejecting premise 1 star. I've already criticized the reasons offered on behalf of premise 1, but what matters for present purposes is that those reasons would, if successful, equally support premise 1 star. A unique hotel room could be destroyed on each of, say, 5 days of the future if the future is endless. Similarly, a hotel room could be destroyed on each of 500 days of the future if the future is endless. The same is true of 5 million, 5 quadrillion, 5 quintillion, indeed plausibly any number, including an infinite number. And if you're paying attention, this is basically the exact same motivation that I discussed. And I'm just altering the wording ever so slightly. This is the exact same motivation I discussed in the context of premise 1. Moreover, there's no specific day of the endless future on which the destruction of a hotel room is simply impossible. And what this means is that each day of the endless future is such that a hotel room is possibly destroyed on that day. And one might think that we can infer from this that it's possible that on all days of the endless future, a hotel room is destroyed. Moreover, nothing, of course, forces infinitely many such rooms to ever be created, and so it also seems possible for only finitely many of them to ever be created. And if all this is right, then premise 1 star is secured. Again, I've already criticized this sort of reasoning. It fails, it doesn't work, but my point is just that if it supports premise 1, then it equally supports premise 1 star. So, I've argued that anyone who accepts the first argument should also accept the second. That is, anyone who accepts the Loc al-Ghazali argument as applied to an infinite past should also accept the second symmetrical argument as applied to an endless future.
Okay, so in sum, there are at least 3 serious problems here. First, the argument still assumes wrongly that Hilbert's hotel is absurd. That's false, and there's no good reason to accept it. I'm with Alexander Pruss, who explicitly says it seems extremely intuitive to him that Hilbert's hotel is possible. The second problem is that we can create an equally convincing, or perhaps more accurately, equally unconvincing argument for the impossibility of an endless future, and hence for the falsity of Christianity, by focusing not on the construction of hotel rooms on each day throughout the endless future, but rather the destruction of hotel rooms on each day of the endless future. And then the third criticism is that the argument could only show that the conjunction of an infinite past, together with infinitely many things coming into existence throughout the infinite past, and all persisting to a given moment, is impossible. So at best, this argument could only show that this conjunction here is impossible. This does not imply that an infinite past is impossible. It only tells us that in any world in which there's an infinite past, it is not also the case that infinitely many things come into existence throughout that infinite past without ceasing to exist up until a given moment. There could still easily be infinite pasts in which only finitely many things ever exist. For example, a universe containing just two particles circling around one another for all past eternity. So I don't think Trent's first sub-argument here from the Hilbert's hotel construction is a good argument. Okay, on to Trent's second sub-argument here, which appeals to Benardete paradoxes.
In the 2010s, Alex Pruss, who is a Catholic philosopher at Baylor University, and along with Rob Koons, who is a Lutheran convert to Catholicism, have worked on a theory called causal finitism. And this is the argument that causal chains must be finite, or at least there can be infinite causal chains that are paradoxical and cannot exist. All right. So we have to be careful. They'll make an argument based on this, saying that, look, even if the past is infinite, let's say you could have Hilbert's hotel. Let's say you could have that. You could have all of these causal finitist paradoxes that arise. And I shared one with Jimmy yesterday at our dialogue. Suppose God made an infinite number of immortal people, and they've always existed, and every year they have a task to do. They pass a paper into the future, for example. That seems fine. But the problem is, if you had an infinite past, you could have this same number of people do paradoxical things that can't actually happen. So you imagine you have Mr. 0, Mr. 1, Mr. 2, Mr. 3, Mr. 4. They have all of these names for each year that they act. And this is Rob Koons' paper passer experiment I explained with Jimmy. Suppose, here's the rule. Each person here is named after a number, one of the natural numbers. And so there's an infinite number of them. There's an infinite number of natural numbers. They have a rule. They receive a paper from the guy to their left. If the paper is blank, they write their name on it. If the paper already has a name on it, i.e. a number, they pass it to the right. All right. So they just go and Mr. 5 gets it. If it's blank, he writes his name. It won't be blank because I'm sure 6 wrote something, and they pass it along. Now, the paradox that arises is this. What name is on Mr. 0's paper? Because it can't be 1. He couldn't get a 1 because we got a 1. It would have been blank here. And if it was, it would be blank when 1 got it. If it were blank, well, 2 would have written his name. And it couldn't have been blank when 2 got it because, 3 would have written his name. And so we have this sort of paradox that arises that if every person in this infinite chain follows this rule, Benardete rule, named after the mathematician Jose Benardete.
All right. So it's Jose Benardete.
You get a paradox. A paper arrives in the present. It needs to have a number, a name on it, but it can't have any particular number. You could also have all other kinds of crazy stuff, like an actual infinite number of papers if they were copying papers from one another. Another variant of the paradox is the Grim Reaper paradox. So the point is, it's similar to the paper passer thought experiment. Every Grim Reaper in Immortal Psi is alive. A Grim Reaper kills him, number 0. He couldn't. 1 would have killed him. Well, 2 would have. Immortal except Grim Reapers can kill him. And you have that paradox that Psi must be dead, but no individual Reaper could have killed him in this infinite chain. The point is just, look, these causal chains can create these sorts of paradoxes. And as I talked about in my dialogue with Jimmy, I think that time travel can't happen because you could have all kinds of paradoxes. You could go back in time and kill your grandfather, but then you would never exist to go back in time and kill him. So I would say that you can't go back in time because otherwise those kinds of paradoxes would easily happen. Or if you could go back in time, God wouldn't let you do that stuff. All right.
All right. Okay. So as all of the wonderful listeners of Majesty of Reason know, I have extensively responded to these paradoxes and their bearing on causal finitism. I've written, by at least as of this recording, 5 published articles on these paradoxes. One is in Phil Studies in 2023 with Alex Malpass, wherein we criticize the Grim Reaper Kalam using a relatively popular theory of metaphysical modality. Another article that I've written on this is in Synthes in 2024, wherein I develop an extrinsicality problem for this kind of Grim Reaper Kalam. Another paper of mine is forthcoming in Mind, wherein I criticize the Grim Reaper Kalam by developing a symmetrical Kalam-style parity argument based on a future-oriented Benardete paradox for the impossibility of an endless future. Another paper is co-authored with Troy from Friction Philosophy. That's forthcoming in the Journal of Philosophy, wherein we develop 2 problems for the Grim Reaper Kalam. One is a kind of interesting companions and guild argument based on a new finite Benardete-like paradox. It turns out you can basically get this exact same kind of paradox in thoroughly finite cases, which tells us that infinity is not the culprit here, and infinite causal chains, that's not the culprit. Another problem here relates to a mistaken assumption about the intrinsicality of the Reapers as realized powers and dispositions within the argument. 5th paper of mine that I have forthcoming in Mind with Alex Malpass, wherein we argued that the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis is far and away the best solution to Benardete paradoxes, and in particular that it is much better than causal finitism as a solution thereto. So I'd highly recommend Trent and others who are interested in these topics to check out the massive amount of literature that has recently been published in response to these sorts of arguments. I've also, of course, made at least a dozen videos on the Grim Reaper Kalam. These can all be found in my Kalam playlist, which also contain videos responding to pretty much every facet of the Kalam cosmological argument, as I mentioned. Here are those dozen videos within my Kalam playlist on the Grim Reaper Kalam. So, Trent is arguing here. He said at one point, if you had an infinite past, you could have people do paradoxical things. I say, why? That claim seems ludicrous to me, I must confess. The whole story is impossible, sure. Right? The whole Benardete construction, the whole entire story is impossible. Yeah, absolutely. But why on earth does the possibility of the whole story follow from the possibility or actuality of an infinite past? Imagine I tell a convoluted paradoxical story involving taxis. I then confidently proclaim that if taxis existed, well, then the taxi paradox would be possible. What? I mean, that clearly doesn't follow. In the same way, the impossibility of an infinite past just doesn't follow from the impossibility of the paradoxical story involving an infinite past. And to put the point in more general terms, all we can infer from a paradox like the taxi paradox, I'm going to explain this in a clip that I'm about to play, by the way, in more detail. All we can infer from the taxi paradox is that the whole taxi story is impossible. We can't infer from it that any particular element of the story is impossible, such as the existence of taxis. Likewise, all we can infer from Benardete paradoxes is that the whole story is impossible. We cannot infer from it that any particular element of the story is impossible, such as an infinite past. In other words, we can only infer that there are no possible worlds in which there is both an infinite past and that past is populated by reapers or paper passers, each of which successfully implements its intention to do something if and only if none of the previous ones do it. But that conclusion is perfectly compatible with some possible worlds containing an infinite past. It's just that if there are such possible worlds, none of them contain infinite sequences of reapers or paper passers, all of whom successfully implement their intentions. This isn't any more mysterious than the impossibility of there being a world in which you and I collectively successfully implement our intentions to think of a larger number than the other, right? So I intend to think, I'm really trying to think of a number larger than the number you think of, and you're trying to think of a number larger than the number that I think of. We both have this intention. We really want to implement it. But alas, there's no possible world in which both of us successfully implement our intentions. And there's nothing mysterious about it. It would just be a contradiction if we were together and we both successfully implemented that intention. And it's the exact same thing with respect to the reapers or the paper passers. There's nothing mysterious going on here. It's simply telling us that you can't have infinite pasts in which there are infinitely many entities who successfully implement their intentions to carry out a contradictory task. This does not tell us that an infinite past is impossible. It only tells us that it's impossible to conjoin an infinite past with infinitely many reapers spread throughout that past whose intentions are jointly satisfied. And here I'm going to play a clip from one of the dozen videos that I mentioned above. So imagine that I tell this story, let's say Dan is going to come and join me at Princeton, okay? He's going to come and we're going to have a fun day and we're going to play some soccer and we're going to watch an Arsenal game and then we're going to debate philosophy, okay. So Dan and I get into a taxi. We're driving all around Princeton. I'm showing him the historic sites. I'm showing him the philosophy department, etc. And then we go back to the hotel, we debate some philosophy, and then we both go to sleep at separate places. Then we wake up, and to one of us, let's say it's me, God appears. And it really is. This is part of the story. The God is definitely appearing to me. And God doesn't lie, okay? God does not lie. That's also part of the story. He always tells the truth. And he says to me, Joe, you haven't gotten into a taxi for the past week. Okay, end of story. Okay, so that's it's a very weird story, but let's think about that story. Hold on a second. According to the story, I did in fact get into a taxi with Dan, the day before when we were going around Princeton. That's part of the story. But also part of the story is that God revealed to me that I had not gotten into a taxi for the past week. And moreover, part of the story is that God doesn't lie. He always tells the truth. And so we can derive this contradiction from the story that I just told. Namely, the contradiction that I both got into a taxi yesterday and I did not get into a taxi yesterday. Now, here's something that would be silly to conclude from this sort of thing. I guess, taxis are impossible. Or here's another thing that would be silly to conclude from this. God is impossible. Another thing that's silly to conclude. It's impossible for me to get into a taxi. Another thing that's silly to conclude. It's impossible for God to reveal to me that I had never gotten into a taxi in the past week. For all my story said, all of those actually might be individually possible. The point to notice, though, is it's their combination that can't
can't jointly happen. And we can treat this as like a cool paradox, this paradox that I've just discovered. It's called the taxi paradox. And how are we to solve it? Should we adopt the impossibility of taxis? Should we think that God's impossible? No, I think the best solution to this is a kind of unsatisfiable conjunction solution. It's that, listen, I have just told an inconsistent story. I've said various elements. Maybe they're each individually possible. Maybe it's possible for there to be taxis. Maybe it's possible for God to exist. Maybe it's possible for God to reveal that I've never gotten into a taxi in the past week. It's just that they can't all be true together. And we don't need to adopt any substantive hypothesis to solve this taxi paradox. So that's exactly how I view Benardete paradoxes in general. Again, we can tell an inconsistent story involving infinity in some way, or involving infinite causal chains, or involving infinite past time. But all we can infer from that, so I say, and so we argue in the paper, is that you can't have that conjunction of elements being the case. You can't have an infinite chain, which is such that each of the members satisfies some condition or has some property if and only if none of the previous members have that property or satisfy that condition. You can't have that conjunction. It may very well be the case that you could nevertheless have some set which satisfies, that condition, right? That each member of it satisfies P if and only if none of the previous ones satisfy P. That may be possible individually, and it may also be possible individually for you to have an infinite collection of items or infinitely many past times or whatever. Really, just like the taxi case, all we should be able to infer from this, so I say, so we argue in the paper, is that it's the conjunction that's impossible, and we don't need to adopt a substantive metaphysical hypothesis.
And actually, here's another interesting point to make. As Alex Malpass and I explain in our co-authored Mind article, and later in the video that I just played, causal and temporal finitism cannot be the solution to Benardete paradoxes, since there are thoroughly non-causal variants of these sorts of paradoxes, and variants of the paradoxes that don't involve an infinite past. And of course, I can equally cook up a future-oriented Benardete paradox. Imagine that each of the infinitely many reapers will come to exist on each day of an endless future. Each reaper will swing its scythe if and only if no reaper in its future swings its scythe. This too creates a Benardete paradox spread throughout an endless future. We can get the exact same sort of contradiction that Trent derives in his Benardete paradoxes. And so, if we can infer the impossibility of a beginningless past using Trent's paradox, we can equally infer the impossibility of endless future using this paradox. And so, Trent has inadvertently refuted his own Christianity. Now, of course, you might be asking, well, how does each reaper know about the future? Well, part of the setup is that either God or a soothsayer or a demon or something else with foreknowledge informs a reaper about whether a future reaper swings its scythe. I discuss this all extensively in my sole-authored Mind article linked above, and I address objections therein, so check that out if you're interested. Okay, now let's get back to Trent.
In Pruss's book, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, he says some people tell him with the Grim Reaper experiment and the paper passer, they say, look, something will happen where someone will drop their paper and not do it. Or a Grim Reaper won't show up to work that day. So there won't be a paradox. And I think, really, why? How do we know that's going to happen? Well, it just has to. So there's no paradox. There's going to be some strange metaphysical force that will stop it from happening. So I would say that if the past is infinite, it can only be infinite if God exists to prevent these paradoxes. So as an atheist, the only way you can get it, normally you want an infinite past because you would say God didn't make the world, it's always been here. You still have other arguments. Why is there something rather than nothing? But even if you had an infinite past, you have these other finitude paradoxes that arise that only the existence of God can explain why we don't have them. So I think that this is a very promising avenue of research that people are working towards.
So, yeah, this mysterious force point is just not plausible in the slightest. You don't need a mysterious force to prevent the paradoxes from arising, any more than we need a mysterious force to prevent Bridget from crossing all 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on herself, right? If you, hopefully you guys are familiar with the bridges of Königsberg problem. Basically, back in, 18th century Königsberg, which I think is part of Prussia, there was the Pregel River, I think that's what it's called, that ran through the city of Königsberg. There were 7 bridges that crossed the Pregel River in particular ways. And it turns out that it's actually mathematically impossible for someone to cross all 7 bridges without doubling back on themselves, so without crossing one of the bridges twice. Euler actually provided a proof of this using graph theory. And so it turns on various interesting features of graphs and their edges and their vertices and the number of them and how they relate to one another. So basically, Euler proved that it's mathematically impossible for someone to cross all the 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on themselves. Now, imagine Bridget repeatedly trying to cross all 7 bridges without doubling back on herself. On one occasion, maybe she'll fall into the Pragal River. On another occasion, maybe she'll get bored and she'll just give up. She crosses 3 of the bridges and then gets distracted. On another occasion, maybe she finds herself doubling back on bridge number 3. On another occasion, maybe she finds herself doubling back on bridge number 7. Various particular contingent historical circumstances will play out. We know that. But we don't need some sort of like mysterious force that's like preventing Bridget from crossing all 7 bridges without doubling back on herself. No, instead, the explanation for the fact that she's doomed to fail in her task here is its mathematical impossibility. We can whip out graph theory and just prove this. Likewise, the explanation, and we don't need to cite some mysterious force that some ghostly logical chaperone that's guiding her path and preventing her from crossing all 7 bridges without doubling back on herself. And likewise, the explanation for why an infinite chain of reapers or paper passers is doomed to fail in collectively implementing their paradoxical intentions is that it's logically impossible for them to do so. And this logical impossibility itself isn't mysterious either. We can formally prove it using self-evident logical axioms and rules of inference. No appeal to mysterious paradox-preventing forces need to be made. And also, again, just return to the case where I'm trying to think of a number larger than you, and you're trying to think of a larger number than me. We can't both successfully implement our intentions here. Do we have to posit some mysterious force, which is preventing one of us from successfully implementing our intention? No, it's just logically impossible for both of us to collectively satisfy or implement our intentions. End of story. That's why we are doomed to fail in collectively satisfying our intentions. And it's the exact same sort of story in the case of the Reapers. It's literally just logically impossible for them to collectively satisfy their intentions. And so we don't need to posit some mysterious force that's somehow preventing them from successfully doing so. So I don't see any of this as any threat to an infinite past. And again, even if the past were infinite, I don't think we need some sort of mysterious force to prevent paradoxes from arising. Their logical impossibility is a perfectly satisfying explanation for why they never arise. We don't need to posit some logical chaperone guiding things. Oh, and plus, why on earth would God need to be the mysterious force? Trent was saying, I just don't understand. Why? Why not an angel or Zeus or the impersonal or the impersonal form of the good or any number of things? So that was a very odd point in my view. And more generally, this is just not a convincing style of argument. So I don't really think Trent has here given particularly plausible renditions of or defenses of the Kalam cosmological argument.
All right, let's talk about a few more here. This is going to get even more heady, but you can have fun. We'll have fun here. The contingency argument. Why is it something rather than nothing? Something doesn't have to exist. It needs a necessary being to keep it in existence. This is Father Kopp.
So it's worth noting that is not an essential feature of contingency arguments, that kind of requirement for a sustaining cause in terms of a necessary being, which keeps things in existence. And in fact, I myself don't think that that's needed. I think we can appeal to any of the half dozen or so metaphysical accounts of existential inertia to explain why things remain in existence. No appeal need be made to a necessary being here. Again, the relevant chapter in my book is going to be chapter 6. Therein, we give an extensive development and defense of these kinds of metaphysical accounts. In other words, explanations of why things continue in existence that don't appeal to an external sustaining cause.
Copleston and Bertrand Russell, they had a very polite British debate about it in 1948. You can find it online. It's super fun but it seems to me the problem with your argument is that, and they have a great exchange with one another, saying, well, how do we know that the universe just isn't necessary? It exists. How do we know the universe is contingent? Those doubts from Russell kind of undercut the argument. So in order to get around it, we use something called, there are people using modal contingency ontological arguments. I promise this won't be painful, okay? I'm going to talk about possible worlds. A possible world is not a parallel dimension where evil Doctor Strange is doing something. A possible world is kind of like a book. It's a description of how the world could have been if it were a little different. If it's possible, it'd be in one of these books. If it's impossible, it's not in a book, like a married bachelor. So there's possible worlds. There's ways the world could have been. So a modal ontological argument would say that it goes like this. This is a real argument. Philosophers do respect this. This is not a joke. It's really interesting. It's possible that God, a necessary being, exists. If it is possible God exists in a possible world, right? If something's possible, it's in a possible world. If God exists in one possible world, he exists in every possible world because he's necessary. 2 + 2 = 4 is true in every single possible world. It's in every description of any world. Well, the actual world is a possible world. Therefore, God exists in the actual world. And we're done. We're good. We can go home. We're done. No, it's never that simple. Honestly, the only premise that philosophers have a lot of trouble with before they sign on to this argument is the first premise.
That's definitely not true. Premise 3 in Trent's argument here assumes a pretty controversial view about what's the correct logic for metaphysical modality. In particular, it assumes that system S5 is the correct logic for metaphysical modality, since the premise assumes that if something is possibly necessary, then it's just necessary, which is equivalent to the characteristic axiom of system S5. But the claim that system S5 is the correct logic for metaphysical modality is very controversial, much more controversial than apologists, and even I myself have led on in the past. Actually, one of my papers under review right now, which patrons have access to, by the way, cites a great many philosophers who, even within the last 5 years or so, have developed lots of interesting new objections to the metaphysical adequacy of system S5, arguing that the correct logic for metaphysical modality is instead a weaker system, which, by the way, would no longer validate premise 3 of Trent's argument. So it's definitely not true that that philosophers really only have trouble with the first premise, or only like serious trouble with the first premise.
Is it possible, not just epistemically, like, oh, we talk about it, but it's something that could really happen? Because there's a huge problem here is that if you have a really powerful tool, you don't want it used against you, because you could run a reverse ontological argument. Note what I just did here. Instead of changing to exist, I change it to, is it possible God does not exist? Is that, I'm sure people say, yeah, it's possible. That's why we're debating it. Well, then if it's possible he doesn't exist, there's a possible world then he does not exist in. And if God doesn't exist in one possible world, he doesn't exist in every one. If he's necessary, he's got to be in all of them. The actual world's a possible world, but it doesn't matter. God doesn't exist in the actual world. The point is, you can take this argument. If you can just change one word in the whole thing and get the opposite conclusion, it's not a good argument. You need a symmetry breaker. You need something to show there's a difference between why this argument doesn't work and this one does.
So something that's actually quite interesting is that, and this is what I point out in the paper under review that I just mentioned, it's co-authored with someone else. What we point out is that actually this reverse modal ontological argument is superior in certain logical respects to the forward modal ontological argument. And the reason is because the forward ontological argument requires a much more controversial logic than the reverse modal ontological argument. And so actually there is a kind of asymmetry between these arguments, but the asymmetry actually favors the reverse modal ontological argument for atheism. And so what we develop in our article is a kind of new and interesting modal ontological argument for atheism, because we have a symmetry breaker that doesn't favor the original modal ontological argument, but actually favors the reverse modal ontological argument. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. That's just like a teaser. The paper is, like I said, it's available on my Patreon for those who are interested. It's a bit technical because we go into like the nitty-gritty details of the various logical systems, and we prove certain results, and we give certain counter models to various claims. Anyway, we don't need to go into that here. My point is just that actually there is an overlooked asymmetry in debates about the modal ontological argument, and this kind of asymmetry actually favors the reverse modal ontological argument for atheism. So that's something that's pretty interesting. Much more on that will come out later on my channel once/if the paper is accepted for publication. Because as you guys know, I very often make videos explaining my published papers to a popular audience. So
to show there's a difference between why this argument doesn't work and this one does. So my friend Josh Rasmussen, who's a Protestant philosopher, has done a lot of work on this area. He's worked on contingency arguments and making really cool ones. He has a great book, How Reason Can Lead to God. This is America, Josh. It's up to down, okay? But I guess we're going up to God. God to Lead Can Reason How by Joshua Rasmussen. How Reason Can Lead to God. He does a modal contingency argument. He says, well, look, it's instead of trying to say against Bertrand Russell, yeah, the universe is contingent, say to Russell, well, it's possible the universe has an explanation, right? Is it at least possible the universe is explained by something that not just itself, it has an explanation? Because nothing in the universe could be that explanation. And therefore, it's possible a necessary being explains the universe. And now we've got something. We've got stuff that exists, and we can run the modal ontological argument. But we can use it with something that's different from the other one. We actually have things that exist that lead to our modal intuition. There must be a necessary being running this way. So I think that's really fun. I think it's a fun thing.
all right, so there's no doubt that this is a very interesting style of argumentation, the kind of modal contingency argument. These are super fun to think about. At least as Trent presents it here, I do think there are very serious problems with this argument. I'm going to go over at least 5 here. So the first problem is that it actually does face another symmetry argument. And this is something that I think is seriously overlooked in the kind of popular discourse over these kinds of modal contingency arguments. Well, look at the original argument. You know, the original argument has this possibility premise. It's possible that the universe has an explanation. And then it goes on to try to argue that, well, then it's possible that there's a necessary being which explains the universe. But notice what we can do in mounting another symmetry argument. We can say it's premise 1, it's possible that the universe doesn't have an explanation. Premise 2, if it's possible that the universe doesn't have an explanation, then it's possible that God doesn't exist. Premise 3, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. So conclusion 4, God doesn't exist. Now, premise 1 is supported in much the same way that Trent would support his first premise, right? His premise that it's possible that the universe does have an explanation. Namely, many of us just find it intuitively plausible that, yeah, it's at least possible that the universe has an explanation. And likewise, it's at least possible that the universe doesn't have an explanation. These just seem to be intuitively possible, at least to many people. Secondly, it's a very weak claim, and oftentimes people defend a kind of presumption in favor of these bare possibility claims in the absence of strong reasons to think that they're false. It seems like there could have been another planet in our solar system. That seems like a possibility. It actually turns out to be somewhat hard to give independent arguments in favor of that, very rigorously worked out arguments. And so a lot of people argue that, well, we're just entitled to these very weak possibility claims unless and until we're given good reason to think that they're false. So that's another way that some people could try to motivate this first premise here, as well as Trent's premise. Trent might try to appeal to conceivability, like we can at least conceive of or imagine an explanation for the universe. And so and conceivability or imaginability is very often taken to be at least some evidence of possibility. But likewise, notice that we can equally conceive of the universe not having an explanation. We can equally imagine that as well. It's not like certain naturalistic views on which the universe lacks an explanation. It's not like those views are just utterly inconceivable. Moreover, Trent might appeal to consistency to support his premise. It's totally consistent to suppose that the universe has an explanation, and consistency at least provides arguably some evidence for possibility, but likewise, it's equally consistent to suppose that the universe doesn't have an explanation. And so then we get equal support for the possibility of the universe not having an explanation. So my point here is that this first premise in this reverse argument, in this symmetrical reverse argument, seems to be supported in much the same way that Trent would support his first premise in his forward modal contingency argument. What about premise 2, the claim that if it's possible that the universe doesn't have an explanation, then it's possible that God doesn't exist? Well, as I argue in my 2023 analysis article, Symmetry's Revenge, very plausibly, the property of being the source of every other concrete thing, if there are such concrete things, that property seems to be a perfection. And hence God, as a perfect being, essentially possessing every perfection, would have this property in any world in which he exists. And so then, if it's indeed possible that there's some concrete thing that doesn't have an explanation, and so is not sourced in God, isn't dependent on God, well then in that possible world, God does not exist. Because again, God's going to have to be a perfect being. He's essentially going to have to possess every perfection. And so in any world in which God exists, God's going to possess this sourcehood property because it's a perfection. And so then if we find that there's a possible world in which some concrete thing is not sourced in God, is not dependent on God, well, then God's going to have to be absent from that particular world. And so then if it's possible that the universe doesn't have an explanation, then it's possible that God doesn't exist. Now, there's an important claim here. Why do we think that this property is a perfection, right? This property of being the source of every other concrete thing, if there are such, why think that that's a perfection? Well, first, at least to me, it just seems really plausible. It just seems deeply intuitive. Just think about it. Being that upon which every other concrete thing depends just seems to be a great making feature. A being that's the source of everything else concrete is intuitively greater than a being from which other concrete things are independent. A being who graciously gives the gift of existence to everything else concrete, indeed, a being without whom everything else concrete would blip into nothingness, just seems to be better than a being from whom other concrete things are independent. The latter being clearly lacks something good that the former being has, perhaps the fullest expressions of graciousness or creativity or providential control over which concrete things come to be, or a loving outpouring of itself to its creatures, because, the concrete things aren't even its creatures to begin with, etc. None of this is implying that God has to create. Again, the property here is being the source of every other concrete thing, if there are such concrete things in reality. And God can have that kind of sourcehood property even in a world in which he refrains from creating. Right? Because it's still true that in that world, he's the source of every other concrete thing, if there are such things. It just happens to be the case that there are no such things in that world. And so this reasoning here does not require that God necessarily creates. Instead, the reasoning is that in any world in which there are concrete things apart from God, they're going to have to depend on God. So that's kind of one sort of cluster of reasons for thinking that this kind of sourcehood property is indeed a perfection. But let's go on to some other sorts of reasons. So in a recent 2023 article, Fazer notes quite plausibly that saying that other things can be independent of God plausibly entails denying God's ultimacy. And surely ultimacy is a perfection. So then we have the following Fazer-inspired argument. Ultimacy is a perfection, being like the ultimate reality. Secondly, a perfect being essentially has every perfection. So a perfect being essentially enjoys this ultimacy. But as Phaser notes, if things existed independently of X, then X is not the ultimate reality, and hence things cannot exist independently of a perfect being. What this means is that any perfect being essentially has this sourcehood property mentioned above. Moreover, other properties that are intuitively perfections entail the possession of the sourcehood property mentioned above. For instance, it seems plausible to me at least that providentially controlling which other concrete things exist, that is, providentially controlling the denizens and hence the character of the concrete world, is a perfection. And that seems really plausible. Such control facilitates artistic expression in the divine creative act. It affords more power and greater ability to shape the character of the concrete world for the better, and so on. Yet a being B that isn't the source of every other concrete thing would fail to have providential control over which concrete things exist, right? If a concrete thing C isn't sourced in B, that is, if C is independent of B, well then B clearly exerts no control over whether C exists. So, providential control over which other concrete things exist is a perfection, and it also entails being the source of every other concrete thing if there are such things. And so then a perfect being would have to have this kind of sourcehood property. These arguments are also similar to an argument found in Brian Leftow's 2012 book, God and Necessity. So for all these reasons, I think a perfect being would essentially have this sourcehood property. Namely, it's the source of every other concrete thing if there are such things. In other words, in any world in which there exists both a perfect being and other concrete things as well, those other concrete things are going to have to depend on that perfect being. And that, of course, gives us premise 2, because if it's possible that the universe doesn't have an explanation, well, then it's possible that there's some imperfect concrete thing which is not sourced in a perfect being. And we just saw that in any world in which both a perfect being exists together with other imperfect concrete things, those imperfect concrete things are going to have to exist dependently on the perfect thing. And so the concrete imperfect thing or things are going to have an explanation. And so if it is indeed possible that there's an imperfect concrete thing like the universe which doesn't have an explanation, it follows that it's possible that there's no perfect being. And hence it's possible that God, a perfect being, doesn't exist, thereby giving us premise 2. Oh, also, just more generally, it's just a core commitment of classical theism that no other concrete thing could even possibly exist without God's freely creating it. So then Trent must deny his own classical theism if he wants to deny premise 2. So Trent himself is committed to premise 2. And this is also just a broader commitment of traditional theism more generally, as W. Matthews Grant points out. It's just a core commitment of traditional theism, as W. Matthews Grant points out, that there cannot be concrete things apart from God that exist independently of God. In other words, in any world in which there are concrete things distinct from God, those things depend on God. And that delivers us premise 2. And then what about premise 3? If it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. Right? Well, this is pretty straightforward. If God exists, the God is very plausibly a necessary being. Trent's own argument relies on this. And of course, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, well then, clearly God is not a necessary being, right? To be a necessary being, it's not possible that you fail to exist. And so then if it is possible that God doesn't exist, well then God's not a necessary being. And as we just saw, if God exists at all, then God's a necessary being. And so then if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. So to lay that out a bit more carefully, we would say, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God isn't a necessary being. If God isn't a necessary being, then God doesn't exist. Therefore, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. And so then we've got this valid symmetrical argument. The second and third premise seem to me entirely unassailable, and they're core commitments of the very classical theism that Trent Horn has been arguing for, so Trent is committed to them. And it seems to me that premise 1 is motivated in much the same way that Trent would support his first premise. And so then, instead of breaking symmetry, it seems that symmetry simply re-arises. As I put it elsewhere, symmetry has taken its revenge. So that's the first general objection to Trent's argument here, that it faces another symmetry argument. The second objection is that, at least depending on what is meant by universe, there are respectable views on which the universe couldn't have an explanation in terms of something outside the universe producing it, views which Trent hasn't given us good reason, at least in this talk, to reject. And of course, as those of you who have seen my other responses to Trent Horn know, I don't think he's given us good reason to project these elsewhere in Trent's body of work. Of course, the universe is multiply ambiguous, right? It could mean the totality of all physical reality. It could mean the totality of all contingent reality. Now, actually, in ordinary parlance, this is not what we typically mean by universe, but it is sometimes how some philosophers will, on occasion, stipulatively define it. A third meaning for the universe is that it's the totality of all spatiotemporal reality. A still further meaning is that the universe is our local space-time manifold that we observe and inhabit, which began to expand 13.8 billion years ago. and so on. So universe is multiply ambiguous. But at least under some of these precisifications, there are respectable views on which either the universe or something within the universe is the fundamental foundational reality. So, for example, Jonathan Schaffer's priority monism, on which the universe is the one fundamental ultimate reality, and the universe grounds its various parts. Its various parts depend on the universe. He has lots of papers on this, developing really interesting arguments for it. There are views on which fundamental reality, or the foundation of reality, is some fundamental quantum field or fields, etc. Once again, the point here is not that these views are true, but that Trent would need to systematically rule each and every one of them out in order for his argument to work, a task he has never succeeded in doing. A third problem with Trent's argument, and I've just repasted the argument here for those of you who want a refresher, is that something outside the universe, which explains the universe, might just be a transcendent but still contingent thing. Notice what Trent has given on the slide here. It's possible that the universe has an explanation. Nothing in the universe could be that explanation. Okay, that only tells us, at best, and I'm going to point out in my fourth objection below that this doesn't actually follow. Okay, but then this only tells us that it's possible that there is something outside the universe which explains the universe. It doesn't follow that it's possible that a necessary being specifically explains the universe. Perhaps the possible transcendent thing, which possibly explains the universe, is just a contingent thing that transcends the universe, like some angel-like mind, or some other sort of non-spatiotemporal but still contingent reality. So Trent sort of illicitly slides from a possible outside explanation for the universe to the possibility of a necessary being which explains the universe. But that doesn't follow. That only follows if the only possible explanation for our universe is a necessary being. But why should we accept that? Trent certainly hasn't justified it. Though, again, note that Trent nowhere defines universe. If he's operating with some non-standard usage like the totality of all contingent beings, then this objection may not succeed. The fourth problem with Trent's argument is, why think the explanation of the universe must be in terms of a being whose activity explains the universe? Why think that? Even if it's possible that the universe has an explanation and nothing in the universe could be the explanation, why think that the only possible explanation then for the universe is the activity of a being which explains the universe? Why couldn't the universe have a non-causal explanation that doesn't cite the causal or grounding activity of some being? Again, Trent would need to rule this out for his argument here to work, but he does no such thing. And there are some candidates for non-causal explanations of why the universe exists. Here's one candidate non-causal explanation for why the universe exists, namely, the universe must have existed. It could not have failed to exist. This is in fact similar to the explanation that many theists give of why God exists, right? They say, well, he must exist. He couldn't have failed to exist. And note that the proponent of this candidate non-causal explanation of why the universe exists, they need not take this necessity to be a brute or unexplained necessity. They could say that it is non-causally explained too, perhaps by citing the nature or essence of the universe, if we think that necessities are grounded in essences, as philosophers like Kit Fine defend, or else by citing other facts, such as ones relating to branching actualism as a theory of metaphysical modality, which, together with certain other commitments, implies and can offer a candidate explanation for the fact that there must have been a spatiotemporal universe. Again, I'm not going to delve into these candidate explanations. This is one of those cases where I'm just trying to give you guys a sampler of some of the ways that these arguments that Trent is propounding can be criticized. And again, I am not saying that these explanations are true or even justified. And look, I even changed the size of my font here. I highlighted it, made it bold and italicized and underlined. I said, I'm not saying that these explanations are true or even justified. The point is that Trent would need to rule them out in order to justify his implicit claim that the explanation of the universe must cite the activity of a being, instead of being in terms of some non-causal explanation. And yet, Trent does no such thing. And in all of Trent's other work that I've seen on this sort of topic, he's never in that work succeeded in ruling these views out as well. So then, Trent's argument faces an undercutting defeater. So that is the fourth problem for Trent's argument here. And then the fifth problem is, of course, that a necessary being need not be God. Return to the argument, he's only getting the conclusion that it's possible that a necessary being explains the universe. And then if you use, say, S5 modal logic, you conclude that there is, in fact, a necessary being. But of course, a necessary being need not be God. Non-theists have whole swaths of options here for what the necessary foundation of reality could be. You can see mistake 103 in my Common Mistakes series. And in fact, I'm going to play that mistake now. It's mistake number 103, being far too swift in stage 2 of the contingency argument. And yes, I recognize that there really is no such thing as the contingency argument. Again, there are contingency arguments. What we're focusing on here, though, is being far too swift in stage 2 of those sorts of arguments. And stage 2 just tries to infer that the necessary object or objects arrived at in stage 1 of the argument must be God, or at least must be quite godlike. So, oftentimes, people just assume that a necessary foundational concrete object must be God. I think the underlying diagnosis of this mistake is simply a lack of imagination. The assumption here just overlooks boatloads of epistemically possible candidates for what the necessary foundation of reality might be. So again, we could break this up into naturalistic and non-naturalistic proposals. This is not an exhaustive survey, but on the side of naturalistic proposals, the necessary concrete foundation might be the universal wave function of Alyssa Ney, Joel North, Julian Barber, etc. This is elaborated and expanded upon and developed in section 8.3 of my Springer book, co-authored with Dr. Daniel Linford. There's a huge literature, moreover, on this in philosophy of physics, literature that we engage with in that book, so you can check that out if you're interested. The necessary concrete foundation might be a collection of fundamental particles, like quarks, leptons, and bosons. The necessary concrete foundation might be a collection of mereological simples, that is, little itty-bitty constituents of reality that have no further constituents. This sort of view, on which the foundation of reality is a collection of enduring mereological simples, has been defended in a nice recent dissertation by Matteo Bonocci. The necessary concrete foundation might be superstrings. It might be one or more foundational quantum fields. It might be the universe as a whole, which may be the one fundamental concrete object that grounds its non-fundamental parts, as in Jonathan Schaffer's priority monism. You can see his paper here, as well as lots of other papers and lots of other literature that have blossomed off of it. The necessary concrete foundation might be Oppe's initial singularity that he's developed in various places. It could just be matter/energy broadly construed. It could be foundational structural relations that build up the rest of reality, as in ontic structural realism. There's a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry dedicated to just this sort of view, and there's a huge literature on it. The necessary foundation might be dynamical physical principles as the ultimate ground of concrete reality. Philosopher David Gunn defends this view in his 2021 article in Philosophers' Imprint entitled On the Ultimate Origination of Things. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of various naturalistic proposals for what the necessary concrete foundation might be. Turning now to non-naturalistic proposals, the necessary concrete foundation might be a deistic God. Consider again Draper's aesthetic deism. You could take Philip Goff's limited God hypothesis, wherein there's a deity at the foundation of reality who's either limited in knowledge or in power or in goodness. You could take the Thomistic ultimate reality, being itself, construed in a way friendly to atheism. Again, just construe the purely actual subsistent being itself as impersonal. You could take impersonal understandings of Plotinus' one, which again is an absolutely simple, foundational, transcendent concrete reality that explains the unity and existence of all composite things. Another non-naturalistic proposal for the necessary concrete foundation of reality is impersonal conceptions of Brahman, which is this pervasive, infinite, eternal concrete reality of pure, unchanging, aperspectival consciousness. Lots of fascinating literature on that. It might be the Tao, which is the non-theistic religious ultimate in various Eastern religions. It's this foundational, formless reality that's responsible for the variegated forms and properties of everything else. There are various axiarchic views, which posit fundamental necessary principles about value, which explain the character of concrete reality. Defenders of axiarchic views include John Leslie, Nicholas Rescher, and I believe Derek Parfit. But since I haven't studied that extensively, I'm going to request that you not quote me on that. And so on down the list of non-naturalistic proposals for what the necessary foundation might be. Again, these are just short glimpses into the swaths of naturalistic and non-naturalistic candidates for what a necessary foundation might be. Doubtless, there are many others besides, but I just want to give you a taste of why it's a mistake to be too swift in the second stage of contingency arguments and assume that the necessary foundation of reality must be the traditional theistic God. All right, so we've gone over 5 different problems for Trent's modal contingency argument that he is defending here. And now we are moving on to the fine-tuning argument. So before going on to Trent, first I just want to say that if you're curious about the fine-tuning argument and some of my views on it, you can check out my design arguments playlist, especially the first video therein where I offer some of my reservations for the fine-tuning argument, though I do think this is by far the best argument that Trent defends in his video.
All right, next one, the fine-tuning argument. We got the laws of physics, and they could be different. This is a book called Just 6 Numbers by the astronomer Royal Sir Martin Rees. And he talks about how the odds of our universe existing are ridiculously low. Illustration I like to use is if you were playing poker with someone and you got a royal, I've never seen, has anyone here seen a royal flush? In a real game. You saw it in a real game? That's amazing. But I bet if we asked 500,000 other people, they'd say no. The odds are like 1 in 600,000, but they do happen. All right, new question. Has anyone ever seen somebody get 10 royal flushes in a row? Fairly. That's the key, right? Because if you've seen someone get 20 royal flushes in a row, yeah, my cheating brother-in-law. Now, why do you think that? Why can't you just be lucky? We live in an infinite universe. Who knows what could happen? We know deep down that that's so improbable, it's got to be design, not chance. And that's the essence of the fine-tuning argument, that things like the strong nuclear force, the amount of entropy at the beginning of the universe, all the cosmological constant, the strength of gravity in empty space, these things are balanced on a knife's edge. It would be much more likely if the universe came into existence under atheism, it'd be far more likely there is no embodied intelligent life. That's very surprising under atheism, but it's not surprising at all under theism because God could have good reasons At least he has reasons like there's 1 in 10 to the 120th power odds of getting us without God. I'm sure God has a reason below that probability for creating embodied intelligent life.
Right. So Trent says, I'm sure God has a reason below that probability for creating embodied intelligent life. Actually, Neil Manson criticizes precisely this sort of reasoning in his very nice article, How Not to Be Generous to Fine-Tuning Skeptics. A lot of people in the literature have made this sort of move where it's like, oh, I'm sure God has, higher than 1 in 10 to the power of something, 1 in 10 to the power of a large number chance of creating embodied intelligent life. Actually, Neil Manson offers some really interesting and probative criticisms of this in his article here. So I'd recommend checking out that article. Here are a few worries about the fine-tuning argument that kind of bother my mind about this. First is theism's flat probability distribution. So it seems to me that the probability that the constants would fall within the narrow life-permitting range conditional on theism is just as low as the probability that the constants would fall within the narrow life-permitting range conditional on indifferent naturalism, since God could have gotten conscious moral agents given pretty much any sort of cosmos he created. After all, conditional on theism, God could have just altered the psychophysical laws so that, for example, particles are conscious moral agents with rich inner lives who can mentally communicate and relate with one another, even if they're, for example, billions of light years away. The psychophysical laws, by the way, are just true statements about the connections between mental states and physical states. Now, in the actual world, these psychophysical laws connect mental states with embodied, highly complex biological life forms, and in particular, certain neural states of theirs. But God could have gotten things of value in pretty much any physical reality, including ones without embodied, highly complex biological life forms whose constants fall outside the narrow life-permitting range. Alternatively, God can just miraculously sustain such embodied biological life forms, even in universes which would otherwise, absent special action on God's part, be hostile to their existence. And there doesn't seem to me to be any particularly strong reason why God would choose specifically embodied complex biological life forms to be the conscious moral agents who harbor value, as opposed to other sorts of physical entities to be the conscious moral agents who harbor value. The worlds containing the latter creatures would have all realized the profound value of conscious moral agents. They'll realize the value of relationships between those conscious moral agents and relationships between those conscious moral agents and God himself, and so on. They all realize physically embodied conscious moral agents, which can engage in relationships with one another and in relationships with God himself. And so the worlds containing these sorts of creatures, like electrons in love and whatnot, they would all seem to realize the profound values associated with conscious moral agents. And there just doesn't seem to me to be any particularly strong reason to expect God to side with one such world over the other, or to prefer biological life forms specifically with nervous systems which harbor the mental states, instead of endowing, say, particles or other physical systems with conscious moral agency. And so then, it seems like we should also be at least roughly indifferent under theism across the range of values for the constants. Because again, it seems like God could have gotten just about the same sorts of values, the things which he's aiming at, the values of moral agency, of consciousness, of creatures engaging in relationships with one another, engaging in moral growth and whatnot, engaging in relationships with the creator, God himself, etc. God could have achieved these sorts of values, it seems, given pretty much any sort of physical reality. And so there doesn't seem to be any particular reason to expect the constants of the laws of nature conditional on theism to fall within the narrow biological life-permitting range. Even if they didn't, God could have gotten these things of value which he's aiming at. And there doesn't seem to be a particularly strong reason a priori to expect God to choose one such constant over another, given that he can get the same sorts of values, it seems, in either circumstance. Now, some people have tried to show that theism would not have a flat or near-flat probability distribution here. For example, Apologetics Squared in his recent response to James Fodor's recent video criticizing the fine-tuning argument, both of which I've linked here, but I haven't really found those convincing. In fact, I actually left basically like an essay in Squared's comment section explaining why I don't find his case particularly convincing. Apologies to Apologetics Squared for leaving essays in his comment section. Hey, it's a service. I tell myself that. So that's one sort of style of objection that does bother me. A second style of objection that does worry me or makes me less confident in these sorts of arguments is the multiverse objection, right? Given that you have a vast ensemble of universes which vary in their initial conditions and the constants of the laws of nature embedded therein, it's not terribly surprising that you'd get a universe whose constants and initial conditions fall within the narrow life-permitting range. And of course, which universe would observers find themselves in? Of course, the ones which are life-permitting. But now, yes, there are responses to the multiverse objection. And my views about these responses actually aren't yet settled. I will say, though, that most of the responses by popular apologists are egregiously bad. But like I said, there are more serious responses within the philosophical literature, and I don't yet have super settled views about them. And so I guess my significant hesitation with respect to these responses breeds a corresponding significant hesitation about the success of the multiverse objection, which in turn breeds a corresponding significant hesitation about the fine-tuning argument itself. Oh, and for replies to some of the popular apologetics responses to the multiverse objection, you can see mistake 119 in part 4 of my Common Mistakes series. Now, one recently popularized response that might be on your mind right now is like, hey, doesn't this reasoning commit the inverse gambler's fallacy? Actually, it's not clear that it does. You can see the nice discussion of precisely this issue in Neil Manson's 2022 paper, Cosmic Fine-Tuning, the Multiverse Hypothesis and the Inverse Gambler's Fallacy. Neil Manson himself is not convinced by this Inverse Gambler's Fallacy objection, and he has some nice things to say about it. You can see also my discussion with Philip Goff, wherein I, and also some helpful commenters beneath the video, offer some pushback against Philip Goff's Inverse Gambler's Fallacy charge. You can see Matthew Adelstein's or Adelstein. I should know how to pronounce this at this point. Sorry, Matthew. You can see Matthew's discussion with Goff that linked here, wherein Matthew offers some criticisms of Goff's inverse gambler's fallacy objection charge. And you can also see Matthew's post here on his Substack responding to the inverse gambler's fallacy objection. Okay, so that's the second sort of objection that at least worries me about the fine-tuning argument. A third objection is that, of course, there are a number of non-theistic value selection hypotheses which explain the data of fine-tuning just as well as theism. These views are not theistic, but they nevertheless posit some reality which is disposed towards bringing about things of value. After all, that's how theism kind of purchases its predictive power. God as a perfect being would plausibly be interested in actualizing things of value. But God is not the only game in town in terms of these value selection hypotheses. That is, hypotheses which posit something that is kind of directed towards or disposed towards bringing about things of value. As I said, theism is not the only game in town here. There are a number of non-theistic value selection hypotheses, which do just as well as theism in predicting the data. Here I'm thinking of certain views which posit teleological laws or meta-laws, certain versions of axiarchism, Philip Goff's value-directed cosmopsychism for his development and defense of that sort of view. You can see his 2023 book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, etc. And of course, there are some other worries too that I harbor, some of which are discussed in my video with Goff, linked above, and others of which pertain to some of the nitty-gritty details of the science, which we don't have the opportunity to explore here. Some of these have to do with issues about like the epistemically illuminated region and whether or not it's like representative and various other things that get very technical very quickly and that we're not going to go into here. And there are responses to many of these objections and counter-responses and counter-responses and so on. So don't pretend like this is the final word about fine-tuning. I'm just here to give you guys a sampler. You're taking some of the artichoke dip, you're taking some of the hummus, and you're dipping your carrot in there, and then you're biting the carrot. You've got a very large pickle, and you're slobbering all over the pickle. Okay, sorry, we need to get back to Trent.
This is very interesting, and that's why some atheists, while there are atheists like Stephen Hawking and others who recognize the fine-tuning problem, and they try to solve it with things like a multiverse, you have people like the late atheist Victor Stenger, who have tried to say the universe is not really fine-tuned at all. People get this wrong. It's not, the odds really aren't stacked against us. And this is all the rave back in the early 2010s. I remember for my very first debate, major atheism debate against Dan Barker. I was 10 years ago. He was a very well-rested young man in the prime of his life. I studied Barker before our debate, and I knew he would bring up Stenger's book against my fine-tuning argument. So just for a little bit of a rhetorical flourish, I kept the book under my podium and explained what was wrong with it. And to explain what was wrong with the book, I cited a paper by an astronomer named Luke Barnes. Since then, Luke has gone on to write an entire book refuting Stenger's thesis and other objections to the fine-tuning argument. His co-author, Geraint Lewis, is an atheist, actually. So the book only says, hey, this universe, the odds of existing are really low. We need an explanation. Now, Lewis explains to Barnes why he's not fully sold on God, but he accepts everything else on the fine-tuning argument. And they dialogue, but they make a very strong case against Stenger's denial of fine-tuning and the other elements that people try to debunk in it. Next one, let's talk about miracles. Does anyone know who this fun guy is? Shout it out. Who knows who this guy is? David Hume. David Hume, the poster boy for atheology, for the critique of natural religion. He was a Scottish philosopher in the 18th century and had some devastating criticisms of arguments that were not necessarily Catholic or Thomistic arguments, but the watchmaker argument, the watchmaker analogy, claims on miracles. And it's persisted to this very day. That a lot of people think they can just cite Hume and, we say, we're Christians because we have good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. We have the Gospels, the witness of Paul, the apostles. And Hume, people will often say extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. Who's heard of that one before? Extraordinary events, extraordinary evidence. So Hume said no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So any evidence you have for a miracle would have to be more miraculous than the miracle itself, or at least it'd be a miracle if the evidence was actually false. And that raises the bar so high, almost no miracle could really could pass it. But we have some newer arguments that really challenge a lot of this. This is a book from, I think, 2008 by John Ehrman called Hume's Abject Failure, the Argument Against Miracles. And while Ehrman is not actually very sympathetic towards Christian miracle claims, he does point out the errors that Hume makes in probability theory and calculus, which is something that was still developing during his time in the 18th century and would take time to develop in things like Bayes' probability theorem, which was developed by a Christian clergyman, actually. I'll give you just one example. If this was an objection, even in Hume's own time, that he kind of glossed over that I think shows the problem. What Hume is basically saying is that, look, people lie, people are mistaken, nature doesn't lie, nature is not mistaken, nature tells us its laws, this is the way it's always been, our uniform experience is never broken. What's more likely? The uniform experience was broken and a miracle happened, or somebody told a fib, or they had too much wine, all right? But the problem here is that how do you know we have uniform experience miracles don't happen? This kind of assumes what it needs to prove. So I have a picture here of British explorers landing in Tahiti. So imagine you're a British explorer and you're in Tahiti, and you run to a tree and eat some oranges because you probably have scurvy. That's why they kept limes with them. They're limeys, so they don't get scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. Then after that, you tell the natives as best you can what it's like in England and say, oh yeah, we, in winter, we go out and we walk on the lake, and we skate on the lake. Now, should these people believe this? After all, their uniform experience in Tahiti for the entire length of their civilization and existence is that you cannot walk on water. That's impossible. That's their uniform experience. Maybe their uniform experience, though, is truncated. Maybe it's missing some aspects of the world. And so that's one of the flaws here. We have more philosophical retorts that are involved to these objections to miracles. I really like this book. This is the other Andrew Loke book. This is probably one of my favorite new books on the resurrection.
So very briefly about the resurrection case. Of course, I can happily recommend great scholarship on this by people like Dale Allison. But I also do wish more apologists would interact with some of the popular work that we could say counter apologists are putting out. So I know James Fodor has his RHBS model that he develops in his genuinely quite good chapter on Craig's resurrection case in his book, Unreasonable Faith. That is Fodor's book, Unreasonable Faith. Of course, Fodor in that chapter draws on extant scholarship in developing his model. But I do think it would be fruitful for apologists like Trent to really sink their teeth into that chapter and this more kind of popular counter-apologetic sort of thing, because that too is also influential with a lot of people. So I think it'd be fruitful for both apologists and counter-apologists to interact on this sort of matter. And so, yeah, like I said, I think it would be fruitful for apologists like Trent to really sink their teeth into James Fodor's chapter there, take it seriously, and maybe even publicize their responses. I think James too is also often willing and open to debates and discussions on this topic. So I'd be willing, in fact, to host a debate between Trent Horn and James Fodor on the resurrection. So let me know in the comments section if you want me to set that up. I'm being serious. Let me know down there if you want me to set that up, and I can do that. So yeah, let me know. I'm going to briefly skip ahead of Trent talking about these books here and move on to Trent's stuff about the alleged miracle at Fatima. Oh, and also I do know that James Fodor, Camille Gregor, and a number of others actually looked at this book and gave a number of criticisms in one of their very long streams. Of course, obviously, I don't agree with absolutely everything that they said in that stream, but I do recall them making actually some very salient and probative points in response to this book. They kind of systematically proceeded through a number of points made therein and criticized the argument therein. So I will also, for patrons, I'll also add a link to that stream in the document that I prepared. So I'll add that post hoc.
And it's not just that. There's also, I think there's other miracles that we should appeal to show God acting in history. One of my favorites is the miracle of Fatima, for example. 30,000 people after the apparition, the appearance of Mary at Fatima, witnessed the miracle of the sun dancing, moving in the sky. It had just rained and people's clothes were dried in an instant. And it was reported on by newspapers very soon to the event. It has a lot of eyewitnesses. You can probably find people, maybe survivors of it. At least you could find people who immediately knew these people, children, grandchildren. So how do we explain this? I think this is good evidence, not just for God acting in history, but also for the Catholic faith itself. There's an excellent article published in 2020 by two Catholic philosophers, Tyler McNabb and Joseph Blotto, called Mary and Fatima, a Modest C-Inductive Argument for Catholicism. I love philosophy. And the argument here is, hey, we're not trying to prove Catholicism, but if you were adding up the evidence, well, it tips the scale towards Catholicism. What McNabb and Blotto say is that, look, if Martin Luther appeared in an apparition with a message from God, that'd probably be evidence for Protestantism. If John Calvin showed up with a message from God, this would be evidence for Reformed Protestant tradition. The fact that God chose Mary to reveal a message in a Roman Catholic context, like at Fatima, where heavy Marian devotion is common and seen as biblical, this gives us evidence that the Roman Catholic tradition is correct. So we have philosophers taking things that are near and dear to us as devotions, using rigorous philosophical analysis to present it as arguments both for belief in God and belief in the Catholic faith itself.
All right, so on to the alleged miracle of Fatima. So ultimately, I don't know exactly what happened. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I think epistemic humility is called for when investigating somewhat mysterious phenomena like this. Nevertheless, I don't find the case for a divinely caused miracle super rationally compelling. For starters, the probability that some event is miraculous prior to examining the evidence is already extremely low. Such an event requires God to exist, to have a very specific intention, and to act in ways that we know he's generally strongly disposed not to act, as at least a general policy. A natural explanation is going to be far more likely prior to examining the evidence, and so the miraculous explanation is significantly hampered from the outset. We can't neglect that. And once we look at the evidence, it isn't particularly compelling to me. We certainly know that there were many thousands of people gathered together in Fatima, many of whom reported seeing strange solar phenomena. What exactly happened is hard to tell, as the reports are conflicting. Some people said the sun appeared to dance, others that the sun zigzagged, others that there was a colorful lights display around the sun, others that the sun came roaring to the earth and then flung back into the sky, others that it kind of became like silver, that it was kind of like spinning, sort of, and still others said that they saw nothing at all. So again, I don't doubt that many thousands of people gathered together for a non-specific miracle predicted in advance to occur that day. And nor do I doubt that something unusual probably happened, as evidenced by some of the strange reports mentioned above. I just don't see a particularly compelling reason to think that something miraculous specifically happened. Why not instead cite a concoction of purely natural factors, like strong expectation of something happening in a religiously charged context, which we know can influence the way we perceive things, together with staring at the sun causing photoreceptors and eye muscles to fatigue and overstimulating the visual cortex, which individually or collectively led to inaccurate visual appearances and various misperceived phenomena, possibly together with aberrant weather or meteorological conditions, either partially obstructing the sun or making the sun look different to normal, together with social contagion of memory, wherein others as reports after the fact shape one's own memory of what happened and get unconsciously incorporated into one's own memory, together with unintentional or intentional exaggerations upon retelling. Spirit of wonder and awe and curiosity and the spirit of religion, as Hume points out, very often prompts people to exaggerate things. After all, we know that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, significantly affected by prompting and suggestion, etc., and so on down the list of factors which could all help to explain the reports. I'm not saying that this is the right account of what happened, and I'm obviously not presenting a worked out theory of all the various details in the testimonial reports. Not all of which should be treated equally, by the way, of course. Some testimonial evidence is better than others, given the date of the testimony, the credibility of the reporters, the kind of phenomena attested to, etc. Instead, my goal is simply to briefly gesture towards a schema for how the various reports seem, in principle, amenable to not terribly implausible naturalistic explanation. Also, even if the naturalistic schema here doesn't provide a particularly satisfying explanation, remember that it starts off far more likely in advance than the miraculous explanation. Oh, and another thing to mention here, I've seen some people push the argument that, well, hey, we have no reports of eye damage, so isn't that either that in and of itself is miraculous, or it casts doubt on the claim that, this was caused in large part, or at least in small part, by people staring at the sun. Like, shouldn't we then have reports of eye damage, so they say? I think there are at least 3 replies to be made here. First, I'm not sure that we have no such reports. I'd have to look into that, which is presumably quite a difficult thing to determine. Secondly, the absence of reports of eye damage is not particularly good evidence for the absence of eye damage itself, at least in this case, since even if people did get eye damage, it's not very surprising that this wouldn't be reported. For starters, it's embarrassing to admit that you caused yourself eye damage because you intentionally stared at the sun too long. And also, it's not a very exciting thing to report on in any case. Plus, they didn't have the same level of access to eye doctors or the same quality of medical documentation back then compared to now. And then a third point to make here is that, at least under some meteorological conditions, looking at the sun does not cause lasting eye damage, even though it can still fatigue eye muscle cells, overstimulate parts of the retina or parts of the brain, etc. Now, for those interested in diving deeper into alternative naturalistic explanations here, one place to start, and again, Wikipedia is only ever a place to start, not a place that you should finish your inquiry, but one place to start your inquiry is Wikipedia Wikipedia's Skeptical Explanations section of its Miracle of the Sun entry. Therein are references to lots of authors who have written about this from a naturalistic perspective, and actually some interesting points are brought up in the section that I hadn't come across before and that I didn't delve into here. Also, a Christian and miracle defender named Caleb Jackson, together with Kevin from the channel newly named Kevijin of Alexandria, made a 3+ hour stream going through various Marian apparitions popular in Catholic circles, pointing out that the evidence for them is typically much weaker than many such Catholic circles lead on. In fact, I'll just play a short clip from a different video they did together earlier this year.
I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on Fatima in general. Are you a full Fatima believer, or do you have some doubts? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Fatima.
Yeah, so I would say, generally speaking, I have my doubts on that, not because I have any a priori disagreement with Marian apparitions, but I do think that the evidence there is questionable. Now, I do know there have been a few apologists who've argued for it. There was Tyler McNabb had a paper a few years ago where he tried to draw a line to connect that with like the truth of Catholicism if Fatima was true. But in general, I've found the evidence for it to be very, very questionable in terms of, it's not like some of the other ones where this is a multiple event thing. Now, you do have the Virgin Mary. So just for the audience, Fatima is an alleged event where 3 separate children in Fatima, Portugal, in 1917, claimed that Virgin Mary appeared to them and conversed with them on several occasions. And on one particular occasion, they predicted that there was going to be a miracle for everyone to see. So I think it was in October of that year, 1917. Crowd of 30,000, very large. I think it was 30,000 or so, tens of thousands of people gathered there, and these children announced this to look up in the sky for a miracle, and people did, and they saw the miracle of the sun, as it's called. Now, what that miracle was is part of the contention because people saw different things. Some people said that the sun looked like it was coming closer. Some said it changed color. Some said it zigzagged. Some people didn't see anything at all. So, there's a lot of controversy behind that, and I'm not entirely sure what to think of it. But I do feel, I think that the foremost point is that it's obvious from an astronomical perspective that the sun did not actually move, because that would be detectable by every metric of the way, right? Not only in one location. So you're going to have to say that if this was a miracle, then our Blessed Mother would have basically caused a mass illusion on behalf of the audience. But I think if you're going to get into that territory, we're saying, well, God or Mary is causing people just to have a massive illusion of something that's not there. That really, I think, strikes from hunger in terms of being a little bit ad hoc, right? It's like, you have a vision or hallucination that God's causing. Well, maybe he is, but if we're agreeing that it's hallucination, it seems ad hoc to posit that it's God causing it, right? And if you already have other examples of people having mass hysteria or mass illusions of this kind of way where people see something that's not really the way that it's reviewed, then I think that gives reason to doubt. And I do know there are other cases where people have gone to places like Medjugorje or other Catholic holy sites, and they've stared at the sun intentionally to see a miracle, and they've replicated that thing, and they usually get eye damage afterwards. And doctors have been saying, don't do this because it's really dangerous. So yeah, if the miracle comes down to a bunch of people who are expecting a miracle, who you amp up in this kind of predisposition, who look at the sun for a little bit and start seeing things. When you put it in those terms, it does seem a little crass to say that this is a miracle when you have people who just saw weird things after studying the sun for a little bit, right? So now, some people think that this could have been like what's called a sun dog or some kind of weird weather aspect. That's a possibility, although at that point you have to say, how did the girls predict this, given, this is prior to modern meteorology, unless they got lucky or something. So I don't think that's the most likely. But you also have this issue of like the 3 secrets of Fatima, right? Where it's like there are these predictions that were given, and most of them there's either question in terms of when they were released, whether it was after the fact of an event happening like World War I or World War II, or they were things that were very broad, that were sort of, something that anyone could have predicted, essentially like one of the world wars at the time. And I think one of them was about hell, but it's this very kind of medieval-esque version of hell where it's like we saw people in fire and demons torturing them and stuff like that, which is a very, late view of hell. That's not the view traditionally held by most theologians, right? It's a very, as I said, medieval view of hell. So I think for all those reasons, I would be very skeptical of affirming Fatima. Now, I will say there are people who've gone to Fatima as a shrine, just like Lourdes, which I know we're going to get into, who have been healed in pretty impressive ways. They don't have a whole system set up like they do in Lourdes there, but people go there and claim to get healed. And there's at least 1 or 2, I think, that are really interesting that I have a hard time explaining by that regard. Whether I think it was Our Lady of Fatima that caused it is perhaps a different story. And then you get the weird thing of, could the apparition be fake, but the healing be real, and maybe God's healing someone just out of compassion for their faith, regardless of that? You could. I think you're stretching credulity there a little bit, but yeah, there's a lot of questions. But that's my general thoughts on the miracle of Fatima. And it's also not, people do use that for resurrection arguments too, like the appearance of the 500, right? Could have been something like Fatima. We don't know any of the details about it in that way. And I do believe in the resurrection as a Christian, but I don't think that particular instance is the strongest case you could have. And yes, I think for the apologists who say that you can't ever have mass hallucinations, they're technically correct, but they're also misusing the term hallucination, where that's not really a term in the literature, but there are cases where groups of people at the same time think that they're seeing something which could be like an illusion, you could say, with an external referent that isn't really there. or mass hysteria, right? And there's a good article by Jake O'Connell called Jesus' Resurrection and Collective Hallucinations, published in the Tyndale Bulletin, to look into. He gives a couple cases that's really interesting. But yeah, you have cases where people, my favorite one is in the late or early 19th century in Britain, Victorian England. You had this guy named, this spirit named Spring-Heeled Jack, who there was a newspaper report about him attacking a woman. He clawed her, he breathed fire, and then he leaped over, a building probably 10 feet in the air. And once this was reported in the newspaper, other people started seeing him, and he had plenty of reports of attacking. Oh, he got me. I saw him here. There's a character, saw him jump over the roof, right? And they were they weren't consistent how he looked. Sometimes he was wearing a helmet, had claws and red eyes. Sometimes he looked like a gentleman. The descriptions were inconsistent. And so, but you have groups of people who think out of fear that they're seeing something and reporting it. I saw it too. You see this with Bigfoot sightings and other things like that. So it's one of those things. And yes, sometimes you do have them simultaneously, but again, it really just depends on the scenario. But you can have situations where you see that. What is it? Oh, actually, if you look, I can kind of see it. It's like you're pointing out, you sort of say that you see, that you don't, but you can make it out if you like squint and you sort of see what they're talking about. It's kind of like that thing, right? So do some people play along? Do some people really think they see something? Do some people not see anything? That's typically how it is. I don't know of any case where, to my knowledge, where everyone has claimed to see it and they all see the exact same thing and they all see it. Usually it's some people see it, some people don't. People who see it disagree with what they're seeing and stuff like that. So.
Pick and choose said that he remembers being at a long Hispanic Protestant service. He doesn't speak Spanish, but at one point, people were falling down everywhere. Everyone was clustering and pointing at somebody's mouth. Somebody said that crosses were appearing on people's teeth. And Pick and Choose said that he pretended to see it, but he didn't actually see anything. But a bunch of people swore they saw. I do wonder if there's ever like a performative aspect and almost like a peer pressure aspect to like if everybody else sees that they see it, like, did you not see it because you're not pious enough? Should you just pretend that, I wonder.
I think it's also worth considering like how God could have orchestrated this miracle if he really wanted to convince people of his existence or of Catholicism or of the appropriateness of Marian devotion. The evidence just could have been so much more spectacular instead of a clustering of conflicting reports and some people not even seeing it and other people seeing it instead of a very non-specific prediction. Like God could have literally just projected the Virgin Mary's image on the sun. There were many people there with photographs. They could have taken a photograph of the sun. God could have ensured that the photographs did in fact depict Mary's face so that we can later even tell upon analysis that the images are not doctored. Like it just seems like the evidence could have been of much higher quality. And it's just another and this is just another potential problem with the miraculous explanation. Like you'd think, if God were doing this to really trying to convince people of his existence or of the truth of Catholicism or of Marian devotion, like you'd arguably expect better evidence than we in fact have. At least by my lights, that's one salient point to make here.
The last one I want to discuss is the moral argument. This is William Lane Craig's version of it. Similar ones to C.S. Lewis. If God did not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But there are objective moral values and duties, objective morality. Therefore, God exists. One of the weaknesses of this argument is that you have to cover a lot of ground. In order to make a successful moral argument for the existence of God, you'd have to show other secular moral theories cannot account for objective morality. So you have Eric Wielenberg, for example. This is his Platonic objective morality, value and virtue in a godless universe. Walter Synod Armstrong has a whole book, Morality Without God. To make it, and I think you can do this, but it's a lot of work to try to show, hey, these secular systems can't account for objective morality. Like I said in my dialogue with Jimmy, it's easier to defend a modest conclusion than a very strong one. So one thing that we can do that philosophers of religion are looking into are abductive moral arguments. Inference is the best explanation. So saying, look, even if you could have objective morality without God, God is the best explanation for interesting features of morality.
All right. So with respect to the moral argument, definitely check out my very recent video with Swan Sona, I think on his channel. I think it's called Intellectual Catholicism, wherein I explain quite extensively why I think the moral argument fails and wherein I respond to Gavin Ortland's semi-recent video defending the moral argument. That video with Swan can also be found in my moral arguments playlist, in which I've also responded extensively to Trent Horn's developments and defenses of moral arguments, including ones that Trent's going to be propounding in this lecture here. So that's just a little bit of background, but now let's move on to the more substantive points that Trent is going to make.
It's the best explanation for interesting features of morality. The fact that we can have moral knowledge at all, like we don't see, taste, touch, hear, or smell objective morals, and yet we have knowledge of them. How do we do that? Perhaps a divine explanation best accounts for that.
Right, so moral knowledge. Trent doesn't really flesh out this argument, so it's hard to kind of assess what he's getting at here. He just says perhaps a divine explanation best accounts for that. Okay, perhaps not. Anyway, there are lots of different ways that philosophers have proposed accounting for moral knowledge, almost all of which don't appeal to God. Trent would need to systematically pursue through each and every one of these and show that all of them fail, and moreover, that the objections that he raises to those sorts of accounts don't also apply to his theistic account. I don't think Trent has succeeded in doing that. I also survey some resources that explain and defend some of these accounts near the end of the video on Swan's channel that I was just mentioning. This too is linked in the document that I'm making available to patrons.
It best explains moral responsibility. Even if you have objective moral values, if atheism were true, aren't we just molecules in motion? Do we imprison lightning for setting houses on fire? Do we morally blame lightning? Do we do sad Dateline episodes with the dun-dun music about the lightning that we should have known better?
Okay, so Trent says something like, if atheism is true, then aren't we just molecules in motion? No, no. The answer is just no. We're also minded beings, even under atheism, who are responsive to reasons and can act on the basis of those reasons, and who can also suffer and intend and act and love and value things. I've already addressed Trent Horn's very poor argument here in my video, Why Atheists Can Blame Trent Horn for His Bad Arguments, whose title, of course, was a play on Trent's video to which I was responding, entitled Why Atheists Can't Blame Christians for Anything. Also, of course, atheists can be substance dualists, property dualists, neutral monists, panpsychists, non-reductive physicalists, etc. Trent's case here relies on the demonstrably mistaken idea that atheism implies reductive physicalism or perhaps even eliminative materialism, and that is just mistaken.
Do we imprison lightning for setting houses on fire? Do we morally blame lightning? Do we do sad Dateline episodes with the dun-dun music about the lightning that we should have known better? Faded black and white photographs coming through, no lightning, we should have known better. Whenever I watch that, it's always like, it was the 80s. It was a high time. But for some, it wasn't enough. No, because it's molecules in motion. There's no moral responsibility there. It just acts. It's determined. It's determined by molecular forces. It couldn't have been any other way. But if that's what we are, then we are molecules in motion. Why do human beings have moral responsibility? Unless there is something about us beyond just molecules in motion, that we can be held responsible for what we do. This girl's...
Okay, so regarding the lightning, lightning is not a conscious agent which is both sensitive to moral reasons and can modulate its behavior in light of that sensitivity. God has nothing to do with explaining why we're morally responsible, while lightning is not. There's a pretty straightforward explanation that makes no appeal to God. So Trent, is making the point that, well, lightning is determined, and so it's not morally responsible. But I mean, listen, I agree that lightning is not morally responsible, and largely for the reasons that I just mentioned above. But when he's trying to apply this to humans, and specifically determined conscious moral agents, why think being determined precludes moral responsibility? Notably, there are serious challenges to this, like Frankfurt cases, which are discussed in the video that I just mentioned, wherein I respond to Trent's argument here. I also discuss Frankfurt cases in my free will playlist. You can click on that. You can check that out if you're interested. So that's the first point. Like, you're definitely going to have to fight a very serious philosophical battle, mired in controversy, when you're claiming that being determined precludes moral responsibility. The second point here is that, well, I think being determined precludes the ability to do otherwise. Trent is also relying on that premise here. Even if a fragile vase never in fact breaks in a deterministic universe, it still seems intuitive, to me at least, that the vase at least has the ability to break. And it's not immediately obvious why an exactly similar point couldn't apply to moral agents in deterministic universes. A third point to make here is that, in any case, even if atheism is true, determinism need not be true. Trent's argument relies on thinking otherwise, as he himself explicitly stated in his video on this argument, to which, again, I made a response video. Those are linked up here. And then a fourth point in response to Trent here is that theism may likewise remove alternative possibilities too. It can do this in several ways. For example, theological determinism, wherein God determines all of our actions and decisions and whatnot, which actually a very large number of Thomists accept, and Trent is otherwise quite sympathetic to Thomism. Molinism likewise arguably removes our ability to do otherwise. You can see my video with Daniel Rubio, wherein we extensively cover a variety of arguments that Molinism precludes our ability to do otherwise, arguments that are exactly analogous to the arguments that determinism precludes our ability to do otherwise. And notice that if these theistic views do indeed remove our ability to do otherwise, then Trent seems left with only risk-taking views of providence, like simple foreknowledge and open theism. Since he's a Catholic, he can't be an open theist, so then it seems like he's forced into simple foreknowledge. Now, while that is a respectable view, it's worth noting that it's a minority view among theists even, and it's very controversial, and there are a number of arguments against it. So Trent's argument here places Trent in a very precarious position. And this is a more general point about arguments for theism, by the way. They aren't as innocuous as they often seem at first glance. They'll often force you into very specific theological or philosophical views, which themselves face whole swaths of independent objections, even from fellow theists. And yet a third way in which theism may likewise remove alternative possibilities is the threat, of course, of comprehensive divine foreknowledge. The idea here is that, the fact that God believed 1,000 years before I was born that I will do X for any action that I will perform seems like a fact that's over and done with. It seems like it's fixed. Like this is just something about God's mind millennia before I was born. That seems like it's over and done with, that it's fixed. And it may seem implausible that I have the ability to do things incompatible with facts about the distant past that are over and done with and fixed. And so then it may seem implausible that I ever have the ability to do otherwise. And that's because my doing otherwise turns out to be incompatible with the fact that God believed a millennia ago that I will do X. And that's because God is infallible. That's why there is a distinctive challenge posed by theism as opposed to our beliefs. And again, I'm just trying to give you a taste here, a sampler here of the various responses to Trent's argument. I'm not here saying that this comprehensive divine foreknowledge actually does indeed preclude our ability to do otherwise. And this argument does rely on some controversial principles about the fixity of the past, and linking the fixity of the past together with our inability to do things incompatible with what's fixed. But notably, at least some of the principles relied upon in this argument are ones that libertarians like Trent use to show that determinism is incompatible with free will. And that kind of incompatibilism is something that Trent's argument itself relies on. So that's the fourth response that I want you guys to be aware of to Trent's argument. It's that theism may likewise remove alternative possibilities.
Her dad wanted to take a picture and thought it was interesting, and she happened to turn her head at just the right perfect moment. And now she's forever on the internet. So moral responsibility, that if you were to say that she started that fire, that would be calumny. You would be held morally responsible because you can do otherwise, because they're not just molecules in motion. Finally, God best explains moral value. God explains moral value. That I remember I had a dialogue with Alex O'Connor last year. He's called Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube, very bright, very British. I'm very envious of his and others' accents. Except when I show up, howdy, everybody. Just can't have that erudite expression. But we had a dialogue about this, the issues of moral values, and he gave me an interesting argument. He said, well, I don't think humans, he was an ethical vegan. He's on a journey there. But he said, I can't see how humans have this special intrinsic value that other species don't, because if atheism is true, we evolved over time. And so in evolution, it's always slight change, slight change, slight change. There can't be one mark where we say, here's humanity, and it's special. It's always, the change is very slight among hominids and primates. There is no point where you can say, it's special, there's human specialness there. So if atheism is true, human exceptionalism and dignity is false. And Alex told me, well, atheism's true, so exceptionalism is false. So I said, why don't we run it in the other direction? I think it's just obvious humans are exceptional and special, that we would care even for permanently disabled humans that are not rational. We recognize we have a moral duty towards them that we don't have to smarter non-human animals. But why? If you're out, you got to, if you're lost in the woods, you kill the dog, your pet dog, to save the child. You don't kill the child to save the dog, even if it's a beloved dog. Why do humans have that? They do have that dignity. So I run the argument backwards. If atheism is true, human exceptionalism and dignity is false. Atheism true, dignity false. I'd say run it backwards. If atheism is true, human dignity and exceptionalism false. No, it's true. We have this intrinsic dignity. So atheism must be false. And he said, I see I've made a biological argument forwards. You've made a theological argument backwards. That's very interesting. So in philosophy, we say one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, would be the nerdy way to put that. But he found it interesting. And Jimmy, at the end of our dialogue yesterday, said that my reformulation of the Kalam argument was interesting and he wanted to pursue it more. And I was like, jackpot. Because that's what we're trying to do. That we present an argument, it's not going to always be foolproof right off the bat. But to say, that's very interesting. Let's explore that more and refine it. That's what we are all trying to do, is iron sharpens iron.
All right, so that's going to do it for Trent's video here. And now we are getting back to my notes. So it's this argument from a kind of special human dignity or worth that non-human animals lack. And somehow this is supposed to rule out atheism. And so in response to this, I say maybe it is indeed true that humans are special. Now, while this is intuitive to at least many people, it's quite controversial whether this untutored intuition is philosophically defensible in light of serious and sustained ethical reflection and reasoning. But I'm happy for present purposes to grant Trent that humans have a special kind of moral worth or dignity that non-humans lack. The problem with Trent's reasoning, in my view, is that it's equally obvious, at least to me, that we're special because of intrinsic features of us, not because of some spooky and ill-defined relation to some supernatural spirit being or whatever. Those intrinsic features might be our rational capacities, which again, that's distinct from actually manifesting or exercising your rational capacities. You still have rational capacities when you're asleep or when various other things like your lack of development or certain various other illnesses or whatever are preventing you from manifesting those capacities. You still retain the capacities. So the intrinsic features which bestow upon us a kind of inherent dignity or worth might be these rational capacities. There might be certain volitional capacities associated with our will. They might be capacities for being a conscious valuer of value. They might be capacities for conceptualizing ourselves and our suffering. What confers on us a special kind of dignity or worth or whatever might be the fact that we're a member of a rational kind or a volitional kind or a kind with a capacity for being a conscious valuer of value or a kind with a capacity for conceptualizing oneself and one's suffering, etc. There are lots of different ways that one could go about trying to account for our having a special kind of dignity by pointing out certain morally relevant features that we have, that humans have, that non-human animals lack, and which give us a kind of inherent moral status or dignity or worth that makes us worth protecting, that makes our interests considerably weightier than those of non-human animals, that imposes special obligations upon others not to treat us in various ways, etc. And also, Trent's case suffers from, in my view, a quite serious dilemma. Right? I mean, like if you're appealing to God as the one who's endowed us with a special kind of worth or value or dignity or whatever, God either has some reason for endowing us with a relevant form of dignity that specially sets us apart from non-human animals, or he has no reason here. If he doesn't have a reason here, well, then our having that dignity is just totally arbitrary, since God has no reason at all for endowing it upon us. God just as well could have picked an amoeba to just arbitrarily endow this sort of thing upon. And I take this to obviously not be a good account of our moral worth or value. By contrast, if God does have such a reason, say because of the intrinsic features of humans, like our rational capacities or our volitional capacities, or being members of a rational or volitional kind or whatever, well, then it's quite plausibly that very reason which accounts for our having dignity or worth or value. And God here is simply serving as an intermediary. God would instead be recognizing certain intrinsic features of us, which legitimate a certain kind of treatment of us, which legitimate prioritizing our interests, at least to a certain extent, over the interests of non-human animals, etc. At the very least, it seems to me that the non-theist will then have a perfectly adequate account of our dignity or worth or value simply by citing that reason, and the charge that atheism cannot account for dignity or worth vanishes. So then either theism suffers from arbitrariness and doesn't really have a good account of our having this kind of dignity, or else the non-theist has an account of the phenomenon, contrary to Trent's objection. Again, this is just a sampler. I've gone into these points in much more detail elsewhere in other responses that I've made to Trent Horn, in fact. For these reasons and more besides, I do not think this is a good argument. But that's it for today's video. That's it for my response to Trent Horn's new case for God's existence. This is the new rebutted case for God's existence. No, but seriously, I hope the various resources that I've pointed you guys towards, lots of papers and books published even within the last 5 years on these various arguments, I hope that these things are helping you in your pursuit of truth. I hope they're serving you well. Whether you're a theist or an atheist or an agnostic, at least being aware of these various criticisms is incredibly empowering. It can help you get to the truth of the matter. Engaging these sorts of things and being aware of them can help sharpen your mind. It can help you develop various intellectual virtues like intellectual humility, recognizing that, lots of people have studied these things and written on them, and there are lots of responses of which one is personally unaware. And so that can kind of help temper our confidence and be appropriately intellectually humble. It can also help us intellectually empathize with others. And, of course, they can help people become patrons of the majesty of reason so that they can get access to this document. But anyway, like I said, that's it for today's video and my response to Trent. Or is it? Man, I feel like Vsauce with that one. So, yeah, my response to Trent Horn here is done, but I'm too excited not to share the following. If you were only here for the philosophy, that's done for today's video, so you can click away. Though before doing so, you need to subscribe and turn on that little bell for notifications, of course. But if you're here for a nice and true story, then you can stay. It's April 15th, 2023. I'm playing rec soccer with my Purdue friends who haven't yet graduated. I challenge for a 50-50 ball. The other player speeds up and crashes into my knee. I hear a snap and collapse to the ground. I remember thinking to myself in that instant, I just broke my leg. My leg just broke. It just collapsed. After being carried off the field, though, I see that none of my bones are broken. And then the reality starts to sink in. I completely tore my ACL, severely sprained my MCL, and picked up some deep bone bruises for good measure. If you fully tear it, as I did, it was completely torn for me. It explodes. It's like a rope. You know, oftentimes when you cut a rope, like you get a kind of fraying, right? And that's what happens with the ACL. The ACL, instead of really like kind of tearing apart like this, it explodes. Your ACL just kind of explodes. My knee was uncomfortable and unstable, but the actual tearing event itself wasn't particularly painful. But what was incredibly painful was the massive swelling the next few days after you tear your ACL. Your knee just kind of like balloons. And wow, that is a lot of pain. After 5 weeks of prehab, so rehabilitation and trying to strengthen my knee before going into surgery and getting down all that swelling, it was time for the surgery itself. To fashion my new ACL, they cut out the middle third of my patellar tendon. So that's the tendon that connects my kneecap to my shin. So they cut out the middle third of that patellar tendon together with some bone from my patella, so my kneecap, as well as my tibia or my shin bone. Now, the pain in the days following surgery was probably the worst physical pain I've experienced in my life. Prescription opioids were an absolute necessity as I found myself bedridden for a week, wallowing in filth and overdue referee reports, trying to review other people's papers for journals. But that, of course, was just the beginning. The long road to recovery stretched out before me. I had to relearn how to walk. I had to gain back the massive amount of muscle I lost in my quad, my hamstring, my calf, and I had to commit to a grueling regimen of physical therapy exercises. These exercises were difficult and time-consuming. They were often quite painful. I performed them every single day, multiple times a day, for literal months. After 7 months, though, of these daily rehab exercises and bi-weekly rehabilitation sessions with a physical therapist, the light at the end of the tunnel appeared. I was finally cleared for non-contact soccer drills. I was so excited to return to my main non-philosophy passion. But just as hope began to bloom, I started feeling pain beneath my kneecap. The pain started mild, but it soon escalated in severity. Within just a couple weeks after clearance for non-contact soccer, I couldn't go up or down stairs without pain. I couldn't sit up or down without pain. I couldn't even use the restroom without pain. And then came the diagnosis: chronic patellar tendinopathy, sometimes called patellar tendinitis, sometimes called patellar tendinosis, also known as jumper's knee, and it's a chronic case of it. And this sort of thing takes, at minimum, around 3 to 6 months to heal. Annoyingly, it's relatively common with my ACL graft type. What it really just means is that I unwittingly did too much too soon with my rehab, and when the pain started, it was already too late. I mean, the tendon structurally degenerates for quite some time without manifesting pain, unfortunately. So, of course, I'm thinking to myself, I had just finished months of costly therapy and grueling rehab, and now I was back to square one with new rehab exercises and no soccer for at least 3 to 6 more months. And chronic pain literally every day for months. Seriously? I was not in a good place. But of course, I don't give up easily, and my love for the beautiful game is powerful indeed. So I begrudgingly began my new phase of rehab. The progress was slow and the flare-ups were frequent, but as the months passed, the pain gradually diminished, and it was practically gone after about 6 months. I had finally defeated patellar tendinopathy, and that meant that my long-awaited return to the beautiful game was in sight. Of course, I prepared for it all summer. This is last summer, by the way. This is 2024, right? I prepared for it all summer with advanced plyometrics, long-distance running, heavy resistance training, soccer drills alone in my backyard. So then, after well over 1,000 hours of work since tearing my ACL, last week I played contact soccer for the first time in almost 17 months. I could only play for 30 minutes on my first day back, but the joy and triumph I experienced made it all seem worth it. Now, I decided to record those 30 minutes and piece together my touches for a short video, but I was very sad to see the recording because my camera wasn't in focus. And so in the clips that I will play very soon, you'll see that for the first half of the video, they're kind of blurry. Thankfully, though, I recorded some of my game time from just yesterday. Not much, since, again, I have to restrict my minutes, as you can imagine. And that recording wasn't blurry at all. So some of those clips will be in the second half of the video that you're going to watch. But before turning to that bonus soccer, here are some photos that I wanted to share. So this is May 23rd, 2023, when I had my operation. This is me pre-op. This is me post-op with my pallid and defeated expression and my barf bag close at hand. So here's May 24th, me doing a heel prop with my little Bubba right next to me. She's staring at me, wondering why I'm not playing with her and why I'm in such a horrific state. This one on the right is about a week later. You can see my left leg, this is the non-injured leg, is like filthy because you can't take a shower until they remove the bandages. This right here is May 25th, 2023. So this is 2.5 days after surgery. These are green socks. I'm wearing white tights, which are supposed to help prevent clots. This is my left uninjured leg right here. I'm flexing my quad here so that you can compare it to the right. And you can see the monstrous swelling. In fact, my tights on the right, they literally ripped because of the swelling. Because the swelling was so intense, it literally couldn't contain it. This is June 4th, 2023. This is about 2 weeks post-op. You can still see this is like massive, massive swelling around my knee. Still 2 weeks after the surgery. Here's my knee June 30th. So this is about 5 weeks post-op on the left. This is June 30th. There's the incision. You can see the swelling has somewhat subsided, but this is still 5 weeks post-op and there's still massive swelling around my knee. So, and then on the right, the swelling has significantly subsided, not altogether gone, but still significantly subsided. This is 8.5 weeks post-op. This is July 24th. My scar is beginning to form together with other sort of scars that you can see around where they made various other punctures. Unfortunately, you can see my VMO muscle, like the teardrop muscle here, is basically non-existent. It's very sad. You just get a ton of muscle atrophy from this. Very sad. But anyway, guess who is back? So we're now turning to the first bonus soccer in 17 months.
And I don't know what you will. If you want it, you can have it. Every color that you see, see, see. If you want it bad, and build yourself a technical masterpiece. Now, kick us out, he'll cover all our sins, he'll paint it wide again, and many years from now.